Hello everybody, today is the big one. We're going to be having a look at kick and bass. This is going to be my ultimate guide to kick and bass. For the longest time I wanted to update my ultimate guide to bass, and I also wanted to include some things on the kick drum as well. So that's why I'm making this video. Now this is going to be a very technical video, but I'm going to try to dumb it down as much as possible. I do expect that you have some kind of sound designing basic knowledge. I'm not going to be explaining what a filter is or what volume is, but everything more complex than that I will explain through and actually show you with examples what is going on when you're using, for example, a filter or something like that. So really this should be easy to follow for anybody who has been producing for a little while. Now the objective of this video is not to show you how I do my kick and bass. I just want to talk through the main workflow things. I'm not going to be saying like you have to use this one particular plugin or you have to do this one particular process. I just want to lay out everything that you could potentially do and all of the pitfalls that you need to look out for. So starting off, we need to answer the question, what exactly is kick and bass? As you can see here, I have a bunch of different examples laid out. These are all tracks of mine, which obviously feature a kick and bass. So we're just going to be listening to them so that you can have a little bit of an understanding what we're actually talking about. So this is the first example. You can hear a whole bunch of different elements making up this track, but there's two elements that really sit throughout the whole track, at least this little portion of it. We have this punchy, impactful element, which is called the kick, and then we have this low frequency element, which just fills up the space in the lower frequencies, and that is called the bass. The bass also has a little click at the beginning, or more of a plucky feeling, but that is not always necessary for a bass line. In fact, we'll see some examples where that is not the case and where the bass is essentially just some low frequencies helping to add extra weight to the lower end of your track. Now I like to think of these as two different elements, and obviously later on in this video I'm going to explain why. For now I just want to show you a bunch of other examples. This example here, I've picked it out because the kick and bass is a little bit more prominent. You can probably hear that there is this continuous rhythm in these elements between the kick and the bass themselves, where you have this taka 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 taka, this kind of rhythm in there. Now this particular rhythm is known as the rolling kick and bass, and it's by far the most common form out there. The reason for this is when we look at what Psytrance really is, the whole idea of it is generating a trance-like state in the people listening to it, in the people dancing to it, and this rhythm tends to do that the best. But obviously this is not the only type of kick and bass that you can use. Here's for example an offbeat kick and bass.
The problem was not the physical. The problem was spiritual versus
You can hear that it's a little bit more powerful, but it also sounds a little bit slower. I say it sounds a little bit slower because this is actually the same track as this one right here. So the BPM is the same, the tempo is the same, but the feeling of this kick and bass is a lot slower. Here's another offbeat bass. This is from an unreleased track of mine. You can again hear that this is very, very powerful and it's a little bit slower in terms of the feeling. What you can also hear is that a lot of the other elements in the track do follow the kick and bass in terms of rhythm, in terms of kind of the speed of the elements and stuff like that. Now obviously this is not important for a kick and bass guide in particular, but it is something to take into account when you're writing your track as a whole. Depending on this kind of perceived speed of the kick and bass, you're going to have different elements on top that actually work with the kick and bass or that don't work with the kick and bass. Here's another example of a different type of bass line. This is what I would call a slide bass or sometimes a progressive bass line. Now I'm not going to be treating the differences between something like prog, progressive and full-on. That is a whole different discussion that I don't really want to get into right now. The only reason why I call this progressive is because this is the kind of bassline that you don't really hear in full-on Psytrance. So hence why I decided to call it a progressive bassline. The final type that I want to take a look at for now is going to be a swing kick and bass. This is basically a rolling kick and bass, but where the rhythm is slightly different in order to introduce some swing into the track. You can probably hear in this case that the rhythm isn't so robotic. It isn't tak 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 tak. It is more tak 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 tak. I don't really know how to explain it better. That's just going to be the explanation that I have for the rhythm here. Of course, we're going to be looking more in depth in each of these types of bass lines, and I'm going to be talking about what you need to look out for when making each of them. For now, I just want to give you the examples and give you kind of like a general overview of what you can expect. For now though, we're going to start by looking at the basics through the rolling kick and bass. For the main part of this video, I'm going to be focusing on the rolling kick and bass. So what I want to do first is I want to just give you an example of the kick and bass soloed without any of the other elements present. So that's what we're going to be looking at. This is kind of the sounds that we're going for. Let's just start by examining this a little bit more in detail. The way that I'm going to do that is by looking at the waveform. So I'm going to be zooming in a little bit, and then we can take a look at this waveform. We can really see where this punchy feeling of the kick is coming from. We can see it at the beginning here, but we can see it in every beat. There is this massive impact followed by this long sub-bass sustained kind of waveform right here. And then we have our bass notes here, which are causing the rhythm. So the kick is responsible for guiding you when you're dancing, and it is responsible for the main kind of like dancing motion that you do. And the bassline is really responsible for adding a little bit of extra rhythm within that main dance that you're doing. It is also there to provide some extra low end, so the kick doesn't have to do that on its own. To show it you best, I'm going to press play and I'm actually going to have it follow. I hope that shows that this is the part that is responsible for the punch, for the impact, the thing that we're dancing to when we're listening to the track. And this is more responsible for the rhythm. So for the kick, looking at the waveform, we know that we're going to be using a sine wave. We really see that this is this kind of traditional sine oscillation. We do see a little bit of a mess here. That is because there's actually also a bass note playing here. And you can imagine that having a kick and a bass note playing at the same time is going to cause some problems. And that's actually going to be one of the big parts of this video, is preventing any problems from happening here. We also can see that this doesn't really look like any waveform that we're familiar with. It doesn't look like a sine wave, it doesn't look like a saw wave, it doesn't look like a square wave, it doesn't look like a triangle wave, but this is actually a saw wave. The way that I can prove that is by looking at the Harmonics series that it uses. Let's take this as an example. Here I have just chopped out the bassline, so we can just focus on the bassline in and of itself, and we'll just look at the spectrum analyzer here. And we can see that saw wave harmonics are showing up. The way that we can see that this is a saw wave is by looking at the first two harmonics. If the second harmonic is one full octave higher as the first harmonic or the fundamental, then you're going to be dealing with something that has saw wave harmonics. Obviously, that pattern needs to continue into the higher harmonics. And what is also important is not just the placement in the frequency spectrum of these harmonics, but also their volume. What you'll see for the saw wave series is that they temper off when you go into the higher frequencies. But in this case, you can see that that is actually the case. So now that we know which basic waveforms that we need to use to create both the kick and the bass, let's get started with the actual synthesis. So I'm going to be using Serum for this tutorial because that is the synth that I use the most. I both use it for kick synthesis as well as bass synthesis. There are a lot of different options. There are specific plugins out there, especially for kick synthesis. There's plugins out there dedicated to kick and bass for Psytrance, in fact. There's also other options that you can use to create your bassline. Every producer is going to have their favorite synth and also, as I said, the favorite ways of processing their kick and bass. I'm not going to be sitting here and saying that you have to do it in Serum. All I want to do is just explain how you can apply all of the different techniques that we use to actually synthesize the kick and bass. So we know that we need the sine wave and we know that we need it to be punchy. Now, the punch of the sine wave is going to come from its pitch envelope. If we go back to the kick and we zoom in again, what we'll see is that the sine wave starts really, really fast. As you can see, this is still a sine wave. It's a really fast sine wave, and then it slows down. It slows down even more, and you can see here the oscillation becomes really, really long. So this is basically just a sine wave pitching down, and you can see that the volume also changes over time. So let's just try to set something up like that. What we're going to first do is we're going to set up a pitch modulation on the sine wave. And let's make it one directional, and we're going to go up all the way here. And then we also want to apply a volume envelope that is going to shape the volume, maybe something like this for now. and to apply that to the volume here. And now we have something like this. Not really a nice sounding kick drum. And the reason for that is because it's not really about these general things, it's a lot about the tweaking. In the sense that this pitch envelope might be the kind of punch that we want, right? But it doesn't really have the tone that we're after. In fact, one of the reasons why it doesn't have the tone in this case is because the modulation isn't actually high enough. Again, I'm going to use an analyzer here so that we can just see what is happening. And we can see that the pitch modulation is going from around this area here all the way down to where the sub bass is going to be. But if we just look at the start of the kick drum, if we just quickly play like this area here, you're going to see that the frequency is going to be much higher. It's going to be almost at around 10K. You can see it sweeping up all the way over here. So we need more pitch modulation. And in Serum in particular, what you need to do in order to do that is you need another envelope. Let's give this again a shape that we can tweak later. And we're going to assign this envelope 3, not to the pitch of that individual oscillator, but we're going to apply that to the master tuning, again unipolarly. So now we have just more pitch modulation. Now I know I said envelope 3 here, but when initially recording this, I did say envelope 3. It has to be LFO 3, which we are using in envelope mode. You'll see in the recording I did actually correct for this. So this is what we have now. You can hear that we're losing a little bit of the punch, but we're getting a much broader kind of modulation of the pitch. So now that we have our basic modulation set up, what we need to do is we need to tweak them. And the way that you can do this best is by looking at the waveform. Now what I've set up here is a plugin called Psyscope. This is it right here. And this is going to allow us to look at the waveform of the different elements of our kick and our bass. Obviously the kick and the bass separately, but we can even have more waveforms in here if we want to. Right now I've set it up in a way that the kick is going into one channel. You can see 3, 4 here. This is one of the sidechain channels of Psyscope. And the bass is going into a different channel. The way that this track works is that it just takes input from these tracks down below here. So it takes the sounds from this track down below here and it sends it into the sidechain input of Psyscope. In Ableton, the way that you do that is not by having it go to the group, but you go to the group down below here. And then you have the sidechain options down here below, where you can select out of the 3 different sidechain options that you have as an input. And those are going to correspond to sidechain channel 1, 2, and 3. There's also the direct input, which is 0, which I normally don't really use. I just like this setup because it's nice and modular and it's nice and easy to set up. So with that all set up, what we need is our MIDI note. I'm just going to plug down a note here, and I actually want this to be in the register of the sub bass. Right now we are in G sharp 3. I want that to be 0. So I just shift it down until we are at G sharp 0. Now this might be different in your DAW. I know for a fact that FL Studio has the sub bass register on the number 2 instead of the number 0. So just experiment and see if you can find the sub bass register. That will be the register that we're working in. And now we get our pitch modulation, and once we play it, it should actually show up right here. So now you can see this is what we get. We can actually look at our kick drum while we're making it, and you can see that there's a lot of problems. For one, the pitch envelope seems to be very, very long. We also seem to be going a lot further than we want to go. Remember that this is exactly 1 beat, so this corresponds to this length right here. You can see that the kick drum only really plays in the first half here, whereas for our example, it plays through the whole thing. What you can also probably see is that this waveform is constantly moving, right? If you look at it, where this peak is right now, you can see that it's going to shift around where this higher peak is. And you can therefore see that the kick drum always changes. Now we don't really want that. Again, if we look at our example, you'll see that all of these waveforms are identical. This one is identical again. This one is identical again. So we don't want our kick and bass to be changing a lot. Now let's fix all of those issues. What I'm going to do is again open up Psyscope, and I'll move it down below here so that I can just tweak it and we can look exactly at what the effect is going to be. So what we first want to fix is that randomized starting position. Now the starting position of the waveform is determined by the phase and its randomness. So this is the starting position. You can see the yellow line there. And then we have this randomness, which basically selects an area where it can randomly trigger anywhere within that area. Obviously, we want that to be 0, so we'll set that to 0, and then we just have the phase where we can control the exact starting position of our waveform. Now you can see it isn't moving nearly as much. You can see a little bit of movement. That might be because of the way that SizeScope shows the waveform. Theoretically, with 0 randomness in here, there shouldn't be any change between every time that the sound is playing. So now we can focus on the length of the kick and its pitch envelope. Let's start with the length. That is the easiest to fix. We're just going to use this envelope and we're going to make sure that it just goes down to 0 right here. We want to fade it out a little bit so it doesn't suddenly stop. And we want to get this kind of shape in here where there is this spike here, it goes down and then it goes back up for this long extended period of time and then it just stops. So as you can see, we can just draw out a shape like that and we're going to get something that looks somewhat similar to the shape of the kick that we have in the example. But the pitch envelope is still way too extreme, so let's actually fix that. What we can do is we can just move it down. And we can also move this one here. This is going to be determining our click. You can hear the difference. And this is also going to be part of our click, but this is also going to give the sustain a little bit of a pitch down. And now, as you can see, we have something that looks like a kick. One of the things that we need to take care of, though, is the very beginning. As you can see, it has a little bit of a fade in. It doesn't really have that nice, strong click that we want from it. And that's because the attack isn't 0. If we set the attack to 0, that should be fixed. You can see that we just gained this little bit of extra space here. It's never really going to instantly switch up because there's a little bit of like click protection in all of these synths. But you can see that now our waveform is going to look a little bit better than before. And we also get a nicer, stronger initial click and initial transient. Okay, so we have our basic kick drum. Let's now look at the bassline. And the bassline really is where a lot of the creativity is coming in. The kick kind of always has to be done in the same way. The reason for that is obviously we dance to the kick drum. So the kick drum just needs to work in order for us to be able to dance to it. It needs to have a nice sub bass, it needs to have a nice click, it needs to just overall have a nice envelope. And to be honest, for most people, I do recommend that you're using a sample kick instead of making your own. There are many good sample packs out there that you can just look into and you can just go into the kicks and you can just select one. This is Psychedelic Intelligence, which is a pack that I really like. Other packs include this one from Black Octopus. This is the Psychedelic Toolbox Volume 2. I also want to shout out Ultimate Psytrance Sounds Volume 1, which are the first kicks that I really used for Psytrance. This is kind of like the first sample pack that I got for Psytrance. And obviously there's also 2 sample packs that I provide myself, which is the Quality Kicks Volume 1, as well as Psychedelic Drum Packs Volume 1. Psychedelic drum packs really is, in my opinion, the best packs for kicks drums because you have tempo-specific kicks. They have a key in there. This key is not necessarily where the kick is tuned to, but where the bass line would be tuned to in order for it to work with the kick. And there are some properties about this kick which are really, really nice, which will help you with the mixing phase of the kick and bass, which obviously this is something that we'll talk about later. And you can see that the amount of choice that you have out of the tonality of the kicks for each of these tempos is going to be very, very big. Now I do have to say these are all the same kicks for the 138, for the 140, for 141, for 143 and so on and so on. The difference is going to be how they are tuned for the exact BPM. So as I said, our bassline is where you're going to have the most interest in terms of creativity and really being able to provide your own sound into it. There are again going to be some basic properties that you need to respect in order for your bassline to work, but there's a lot more freedom in what you can actually do in the synthesis and how you can process them. As I said before, the bassline is going to be a saw wave, so that's what we'll be using here. What you've probably heard in that bassline is that it again has this very plucky feeling to it. Again, to just give you an example of the bassline on its own. Note that this has this plucky feeling and then this sustained kind of lower mid-range sound. So in order to achieve that, we're not going to use any kind of pitch. In this case, the click isn't coming from the pitch modulation like we saw before with the kick. It's actually coming from the filter. And the way that we're doing it in this case is that we're not changing the frequency of this one individual sine wave. We're taking the saw wave, which is a very broad frequency spectrum kind of sound, and we're just removing all of the high frequencies over time. In order to do that, I'm again going to use an LFO, which I'm going to set to envelope mode. This is how I do both my kick synthesis and my bassline synthesis. I use the LFOs in envelope mode because you have very nice control over exactly what you're going to do with like the points and everything, as opposed to the normal envelopes, which a lot of people use. Now, in this case, for my bassline, what I want to do is I want it to be a little bit faster. What we saw with the LFO before is that I use the LFO on a quarter note. As we can see right now with the setting, this is a quarter note. What I want to do for my bassline is I want to set this to a 16 note. And again, we're just focusing on rolling basslines for now. So I'm going to move the filter cutoff down a little bit so that we get a larger amount of modulation. And I'm just going to set this here. So now this is being triggered. Let's again set up a MIDI for that. And let's create something like this. To be honest, I don't know what key I used here. This is also G sharp, so this is going to work with G sharp. And again, we want this to be in the sub bass frequency. So we're going to move it down 1, 2, 3 until we get to G sharp 0. And you can hear that we already get that clicky feeling that we want. But you might notice that there's something a little bit off about that click. We're not getting the same click every time. The reason for that is because of the properties of the saw wave in regards to this clicking part of the waveform right here. You can see that it's basically just like ramping up slowly, 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 and then it clicks down here. What actually happens in terms of the waveform is that a lot of the higher frequencies of that waveform exist primarily in this high click here. So what we want is we want it to always start off the bassline with this high click so that we get this really nice high click at the beginning of it, and then we go into the rest of the bassline. So in order to do that, we again are going to set the randomness to 0. We don't want any randomization on the starting point. We just want it to start right before that click here, and then we're going to get a nice click at the beginning. Again, I'm going to set attack to 0 here, and we should have a nice click every time now. You can hear how the bassline sounds a lot more stable and a lot more the same when it's playing. Now again, we have the possibility to tweak exactly what our bassline is going to sound like by just moving around and experimenting with some of the points here. Usually I go for a shape that looks somewhat like this on my filter envelope. Overall, you're going to get a faster click and you're going to be getting a little bit more of a sustained mid-range out of this. One of the very interesting parts is where you're placing this point in terms of the height. This is going to be determining kind of the openness of the bass sound. A higher point here is going to have your bass sound more heavy in the mid-range, whereas having this point a lot lower, it's going to be focused a lot more on the sub-bass. And therefore, we kind of say that this is the openness of the bass sound. Now, another thing that you can experiment with and that you should play with is the filter type. Right now, we're going for a 12 dB per octave filter, which means that for every octave in terms of the frequency range, the dB amount is going to slope down by 12 dB, as the name 12 dB per octave implies. We can also try an 18 dB per octave, or 24 dB per octave. Note that this has a lot of effect on the kind of tonality of that mid-range, as well as how fast that click is being removed. Now, what we don't want is any resonance. I can give you an example of what too much resonance sounds like. You can probably hear that you get this kind of wonky sounding mid-range. In fact, I would always recommend no resonance at all on your filters, whatever kind of filter that you're using. You just want it to slope down stably like this. When you add resonance, as you can see, you get that little spike in there. We don't want any of that. We just want it to slope down around the filter cutoff. Okay, so we have the tonality out of the way, but what we probably want is to have a look at the volume over time. As you can see, the volume starts out fairly high and then it lowers down a little bit, and then towards the end here, before the next note hits, it really just trumbles up. Now, a lot of this has to do with the processing. As you can see, this isn't a saw wave waveform, whereas if we look at our waveform in the size scope, it's going to have much more of a saw wave look to it. You can just see we have this ramp up here, we have that initial transient that we set. But what we can see is that right here, the volume isn't going to 0 right before the next transient. And that's actually a little bit of a problem. What we want is we want every transient of that bass note to really come through the mix. In order to do that, we not only need to make sure that there isn't like any bass note playing from the last bass sound, we need to make sure that it rolls off a little bit before that. In order to do that, we're going to use another LFO here, set to envelope mode, and we'll set it to 16. And we're just going to give it a volume shape like this. And you'll notice right now that this really returns to 0 here. Also, for some reason, we have lost the transient spike going to the top here. Maybe we need to set this a little bit earlier. Now we have it, and you can hear that that click is instantly being brought back. So now we have the very basics of an initial kick patch and an initial bass patch. What is interesting though is the way that these sum together. Let's look at the summing of them together, and you can probably see that there's going to be a major problem right here. Our waveform, if we look at it, it looks really nice and flat for the most part, right? Especially looking at the top, all of the different peaks, all of the different stages of our beat of the different waveform kind of hit the same volume, except for these massive spikes here. These have very, very high volume. And the reason for that is because the kick and the bass are playing together here. So these two waveforms are going to sum together. This whole idea of these waveforms summing together is called summing. That's why this part here is also called summing. You can see the sum of all of the inputs together. Generally speaking, what we want to achieve is a waveform that looks nice and flat when we look at it on a waveform analyzer like this. Again, looking at our kick and bass example from before, you can see that with exception of these little spikes here, there's nothing that really comes above kind of like this main volume line that we see here, both at the top as well as down below. It's nice and flat and nice and compressed looking. Now this kick and bass is actually from a production project, so this isn't mixed or mastered or anything like that. Once we get into mixing and mastering, it's going to be even more pronounced that you get this kind of flat, sustained feeling out of your kick and bass. So in order to do that, what we want to do is we want to probably play with the volume of this bass note here. Because if we lower the volume of this bass note, then the sum of the two is also going to be lower in volume. Now a lot of you are probably screaming at the monitor, phase alignment, but not yet. We're going to get to that in a little bit. There's actually a good reason why we don't want to do phase alignment right now at this particular point. Changing the volume of the first bass note is often done with sidechaining, but personally I like to use velocity more, as that way you're turning up or down the volume of the entire bass note uniformly. I just set a lower velocity for this note here, and then within the synth that you're using, you need to assign the velocity to the volume. In this case, we already have this assigned to the volume, so what you want to do is you want to go into the matrix and use the volume as an auxiliary source, or the velocity as an auxiliary source like this. And now again, looking at our waveform, we can see that that first note plays a lot lower in volume than the other two. And now if we look at the sum, we can see that we get a nice flat sum out of it. So this is the basis of synthesis. There's going to be a lot more in terms of the synthesis later on, but this is just going to be the basic part. What I now want to take a look at is the processing. And let's start with the processing for the kick, because there's a few different small interesting things that are important to note. But basically when it comes to the processing for the kick, for me, the golden rule is the less that you do, the better it is. In fact, the reason why I say that people should look into using samples is because you can just drag in a sample and you're probably going to be all right. Maybe a little bit of EQing, but that's going to be it. When it comes to kick processing, personally, what I like to do in terms of the EQing is I just like to remove kind of around 10K and above, like this area here. This is more of a mixing thing. I don't want this area to clash with all of the top loops and all of the drums that are going to be pushed into the track later. But what is really interesting about something like EQing for the kick is that changing the EQ is basically the same as changing the amplitude of a specific position of the waveform. Because this is basically like a sweep throughout the frequency spectrum, you can imagine that if I boost this part of the frequency spectrum, it's going to correspond to a particular kind of speed of this sine wave. So we're just boosting that part of the sine wave in that case. Now, I may have noticed while I was doing that experiment that it wasn't just going up in volume, it was also slightly moving back and forth. And that might not look like a big problem, but this is the biggest problem in Psytrance kick and bass synthesis. When we're using any type of filter, either a low pass filter like we have here or a peak filter like we have here, you're going to introduce some kind of phase shift. The easiest way to actually visualize that kind of phase shift is actually in Serum, I found. If you double click here once, twice, you can see we get this graph here, which is labeled phases. This is going to be the phase shift applied to the signal, just like this is going to be the amplitude applied to the signal. Now, I have assumed at this point that you have a basic understanding of sound design. I've tried to dumb it down as much as possible, but I'm obviously not going to explain like what a filter is, what amplitude is, what volume is. I do kind of have this prerequisite that you at least know a little bit about sound designing and stuff like that. What I am going to explain though is what the phase is of different harmonics. When we look into a saw wave, for example, this one here, we can see that we have this saw wave amplitudes. We've looked at this before in this video where we looked at the bassline and we saw this pattern of the harmonics. If we look at the square wave, the big differentiator between the saw wave and the square wave is that you have every other bin selected here instead of every bin. So this particular amplitude pattern over here is actually what is responsible for the saw wave. Again, if we look at it on a spectrum analyzer, we're going to see something like this, where the first harmonic is, in this case, A#1, the second harmonic is going to be A#2, or exactly an octave. This is actually very handy information if you're ever struggling to determine the key of a track. What you can do in the track is, instead of looking at what the sub bass is and what the frequency of the sub is, usually you'll find that around here, you can just look at the first harmonic, and if you can see if it's kind of similar, you can use the first harmonic to actually see what the actual frequency is. In this case, if we're analyzing a track for a key and we cannot really see what is happening to the sub bass in terms of the exact frequency that it's hitting, we can just look at the first harmonic. Oh, G sharp, that's going to be G sharp. Okay, then we know that the key is G sharp. And as a result, we also know that the bassline is using a saw wave. If we look at this and we see G sharp here, and then we go to the first kind of spike in the spectrum, and we say, in this case, we see D sharp, we know that it's not going to be a saw wave, because if it were a saw wave, we would expect another G sharp above that. Something that we saw before is that this second harmonic here is going to be an octave. Let's actually, again, verify that. Let's set this to 0, and I'm quickly going to gain stage it so that it's at its maximum volume. I'm going to introduce this. And if I remove this, you can see that we have two sine waves here. So this is the doubling of this first individual sine wave here. So this is an octave, right? And all of these other ones are also multiples here. So you can just say, okay, this is 1, so this is going to be 1 times the frequency that we're playing at. This is going to be 2 times the frequency that we're playing at. This is 3, this is 4, this is 5, this is 6, 7, 8, and so on and so on. In this case, all of the individual octaves of the starting frequency of the starting key here that we're playing in this bin 1 is highlighted in Serum, so you can see that the 8th harmonic is also going to be an octave. In this case, it's the 1 to 3rd octave of the sound. And we can actually verify that fact if we take the 8th harmonic that we have right here, and if we turn that off, we can hear what this is doing. Let's turn it up like that. I'm going +3 octaves. And we can hear that it's actually the same pitch that we're triggering. Of course, all of this is relative to the key that you're playing down below here. So essentially what is going to happen is, say that you're playing this key here, this frequency. It's going to assign that frequency to the first harmonic, and then it's just going to do the multiplication to get all of the other frequencies for all of the other sine waves that create this waveform. So that's kind of how you can read these graphs. These are just the equivalents of the spikes. You may have seen that the lowest spike was the highest in volume, and then the second one, and then the third one, and then the fourth one, and so on and so on. And it's kind of rolling off like that. That is what this graph is telling us. What the graph below us is telling us is the phase of all of these harmonics. When it comes to harmonics, what they really are is just individual sine waves. And just like our main oscillator has like a starting point, and in this case, a randomization of that starting point, each of these harmonics also has a starting point. It's being in itself a sine wave. It also has a starting point from where it starts to play. Now, by moving these starting points, I can actually show you that there is this sine wave in here. If I just move this slightly, you can see that this sine oscillation starts to appear. That is because the phase has a very big influence also on the shape. So you can see that if I move it back, we again get the saw wave. And if I move it further away again, we get something that looks like a saw wave, but it has this one spiky oscillation in here, which is that one sine wave where the phase is just set differently. So how does this all relate together? How does this relate to our bassline and our filtering that we're doing and all of that stuff and the processing that we're about to do? Well, if you remember, I said at the beginning that the bassline uses a saw wave, but it doesn't look like a saw wave, right? We looked at the waveform here and we see that, oh, this doesn't look like a saw wave. It doesn't have your traditional like spike and then ramp either up or down and then another spike. But when we looked at the spectrum of it, when we looked right here, we did conclude that it was a saw wave. So something must be changing the phase of these different harmonics in order for the waveform to look like this as opposed to a saw wave. Now, the thing that is doing that is actually the phase here of the filter. Right now, we're using one filter on this patch here, and so not a lot is changing. But you can imagine that if I apply more and more filters, that the waveform is going to change more and more and more because we're influencing the phase more and more. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up an EQ and I'm going to be applying a high pass filter to this signal here. Now, we saw before that the phase graph, it's not just around the filter cutoff. It's not just around this point where the filter is going down. You can see how far the phase rotation affects even the highest frequencies here. So a filter down below here is going to change the phase of a lot of this spectrum actually. And we can see that if we play it, the waveform now looks different. And if I add another one, it looks different still. And if I add another one, we get even more difference. And really you could do your processing like this. You can just add a bunch of filters and you can just say, okay, I want maybe this a little bit higher. As you can see, we're able to change the waveform now, and we can pretty much with these filters dial in the exact waveform that we want. There is a little bit of a problem though, because we don't really want this filter to actually influence the amplitude of the harmonics. We just wanted to change the phase. Now luckily, there is a type of filter that allows us to just change the phase and not the actual amplitude. You might be saying, oh, it's an all-pass filter, but it's actually a lot easier than that. It's a multiband crossover filter. If you have ever looked at a different tutorial talking about kick and bass and you've seen a multiband in there, this is the reason why multibands are used. It's not about the actual processing that is happening on the different bands. In fact, you can see that for this example, the ratio of both of these processors is 1:1. So no compression, which is what this plugin does, is actually being applied. We're not actually processing the signals that we're splitting up. We're just splitting up the signal so that we get that phase shift, and then we're summing it back together again. So this allows us to place a whole bunch of different filters in here. In this case, I can go up to 5 filters if I want to, and I can just set this wherever I want. I can kind of tweak these and tune these to get the exact waveform and the exact sound that I want. But there are some things that you need to keep in mind when you're actually tweaking this. The very first one is that you cannot actually shift the phase forward in this way. What I mean by that is, again, if we look at this graph, you can see that this is positive and negative. What that really means is that, say that the phase is right here where we have our starting position. Let's actually look at this from a new waveform so that I don't mess up the phase parameter here. And we're again focusing on the individual harmonics right now, not our main waveform. So I really should be showing you these phases, but it's a lot easier to actually show in here. So imagine this being our starting position. How you can read this graph is that one of the sides is going to go down. I believe that in this case, it's the lower, and then the other one is going to go up. So this is an increase in this phase parameter. It's moving the waveform a little bit more to the left. And this is a decrease in the phase parameter. It's moving the waveform a little bit to the right. However, in the digital audio workstation world, you cannot really process a signal that has not yet been generated. So what that means is that even though the phase shift looks like this, where it's going forward and then backwards for different frequencies, it can only really ever go backwards in phase. Because otherwise what that would mean is that the bassline would need to start playing here. If you take this waveform and just shift it forwards in phase, shift that harmonics forwards in time, you cannot really do that. So it has to shift backwards in time. This becomes very, very interesting if you place a lot of the filters very close to the sub-bass. You can see that this whole oscillation here is starting to play. This is one extra oscillation of the sub-bass that before the filter just used to be part of this little cell here, this little waveform here. What you can also probably see is that this part of the waveform is a lot closer to silence. It's a lot closer to this line here. It doesn't have this spike that you see in here. And the reason for that is because the sub-bass has shifted away from this part here and it's just shifted backwards and it now starts playing somewhere around here, around this area, and it just continues to play up until it stops here. In fact, you can see that the sub-bass from this bass note influences the transient right here. The effect is a little bit less pronounced, but it's still present in here. You can see the sub-bass coming in here, pushing this transient up a little bit, and then basically it's returning to zero. The reason why it's less pronounced here is because obviously this is lower volume, but you can see here what is happening is that the sub-bass is just kind of shifting backwards in time. Now you might ask yourself, why exactly would the sub-bass do that? Why would the sub-bass shift so far back in time and not, for example, a higher harmonic like this one? Well, if we think about it, let's apply a 180-degree phase shift to this sine wave here. If I do that, you can see, let's set this to 50%, which is going to correspond to 180 degrees away from 0%. You can see it moves exactly like half a cycle this way. The part that was the beginning is now the end, and the end has wrapped around and come back to the beginning and is now the beginning. You can see that happening if I do it slowly. You can just see it kind of moving back, and every part that kind of comes here is consumed here, just gets added on back to the initial part here. This is different from the thing that we saw before in the sense that you can actually go forward in time, because here we're generating, we're not processing something. The signal doesn't exist already. So in this case, we are taking parts that are at the end and putting it back at the beginning of the signal, at the basically like forwards in time. And the reason why we're able to do that is because we're generating the signal. We're creating the signal here. We're not processing a signal. When it comes to filters, filters have to deal with signals that already exist, and they can only process a signal that has already passed through the filter. They cannot process a signal that has not reached the filter yet. So if this were a filter, we would see the same shift backwards, but obviously it wouldn't wrap around because a filter cannot look into the future. Whereas when you're generating a sine wave, you can obviously just generate the sine wave however you want. So now let's take a higher harmonic. Let's take the 16th harmonic in here and just place it in there so that we also get that in the signal. If you apply 180 degrees of phase shift to that, you can see that it also shifts 180 degrees, but that 180 degrees is 1/16 the length of the sub-bass. Because the sub-bass is one long oscillation here, shifting it around a lot, you can see how massively the waveform changes as opposed to shifting this around a lot. Here the main bulk of the waveform stays the same, you just have this one kind of repeating spike that moves around. So that's why sub-bass is moving so much. Now another interesting thing is that the steepness of the filter also increases the amount of phase shift. I again can show you that by going into Serum. Here we can again see the phase shift of this 24 dB per octave. If I go lower and lower and lower, you can see that the phase shift is becoming less drastic. It's just in this case going up, one spike, and then going down. Here, there's the spike exactly around the filter cutoff. That's actually how a 12 dB per octave filter is defined as well. In terms of the phase relationship, you have one side going up, and you have this spike where it wraps around. Because this is measured in degrees, you can imagine that it just kind of wraps around to the start again. The highest point here and the lowest point here are actually the same value. It's just that they're displayed in the way that they exist on both extremities of this kind of circle. Because again, we're dealing with degrees of phase here, you really should be measuring that on a circle, but that's too mathematical to really get into any practical use, so it's just like interesting to know. Anyway, if we go up higher, you can see that we get more of a drastic phase shift. You can see that we get another like strange spike here. And then for 24 dB per octave, what you'll see is that we have two spikes, one here and one lower. I can move that in the middle here. And now you can see that instead of one spike like that, we get two spikes at either side, which means that the phase shift is just more drastic. So in this case, I could change the steepness maybe to 72 dBs per octave. That's going to be a really extreme example. But you can see right now that the phase shift is a lot bigger than it was before. So what do we actually want to achieve here? What is it that we want to do with this processing? Well, there's a few things. One of the things that you may have noticed when we set that really high filter steepness is that the sound gets this kind of lasery property. It starts to sound like it's zapping down, like we have a pitch envelope on there. And it almost kind of is a pitch envelope in the sense that we are shifting the lower harmonics much further backwards than the higher harmonics. So you almost get the same kind of pitch envelope that you would get on the kick. But that's not exactly what we want. We don't really want a laser, we just want the beginnings of that effect. In fact, I would say that the 24 dB per octave filter that we're using here is giving us a pretty nice sound in that regard. What we would also like is a lot of space for the transient. In this case, what we're doing is, as you can see, we're shifting the sub bass backwards, which leaves us with a lot of space here, as opposed to if we turn this off, where the transient really has to battle immediately with the loudest part of the waveform. Note that there's a lot less stuff happening here in terms of the loudness than there is when we bypass this plugin. So we're making space for the transient, which is actually really nice because that allows us to compress our bassline and get a little bit more punch out of the transient without the sub bass being in the way. So those are the two things. We want that punchy sound that you get from that phase shift, and we also want the sub bass to shift away so that we have a lot of space for the transient. Now I really have to go into the kind of processing that people tend to use. There's a lot of different plugins that people like to use. They all kind of boil down to doing the same thing in that they're a multiband effect that usually does some kind of other processing. When it comes to the other processing, you might be interested in the other processing that is happening. Sometimes people like to use a plugin like FabFilter Saturn or Quadrafuzz or other kind of plugins that do maybe some kind of saturation, sometimes transient shaper, stuff like that. And sometimes people are actually interested in the processing that is being applied to each individual band. But most of the time we are just interested in the actual phase shift happening from the filters. And just to clear up a misconception that many people have, most digital filters are implemented in the same way and cause the same type of phase shift. So if you're saying, oh, I like this plugin because it does its phase shift very, very nicely, that's not really saying much because it's going to do it the same way as the other plugins. What you might enjoy more is the actual processing that that plugin applies, but the phase shift that you're going to get for 99% of all plugins is going to be exactly the same way. So Vitamin is a plugin that a lot of people use. I've used it in the past as well for my basslines. And again, as you can see, we have 4 filters here where we can set however we want. You can see the filter position changing here. And we can start to shape the waveform the exact way that we want it to. We can also actually apply some of the processing. If we want, we can apply some processing here. And you can hear that this is doing some kind of processing. In this case, I do believe it's either a punch thing or a just like a volume increase, like a compression and just a loudness increase of this particular frequency that we have selected with the filter. To be honest, I don't really know what this does and I don't really care because when it comes to processing, I purely like to use the filters. I don't actually do any kind of processing in terms of applying different things to different bands. Another plugin that is often used, as I said before, is FabFilter Saturn, where you can saturate individual parts of the frequency spectrum. Again, I don't really use it. In fact, I don't even have FabFilter Saturn installed. That's why I'm using M-Saturator MB, which is basically doing the same thing. Again, in this case, personally, I just like to use the filters as opposed to actually processing the bassline this way. The way that I like to really process my bassline is I set up the phasing initially and then I go into stuff like saturation, compression, EQing and stuff like that. But of course, you can actually do both things at the same time. If you really want to, what you could do is set the filters to your liking here. And then say, okay, I want a little bit of extra saturation on here maybe. Let's drive it a little bit in the input. Let's maybe say, oh, I want a little bit more here. Maybe I just want a little bit more volume out of this frequency area. And get something like that. So you can 100% just choose to process your bassline actually with the processors that are used in the multiband plugins that you're using also for your phase shift. Now there are other ways to apply this phase shift. One of the tools that I like to use is Freeform Phase. As you can probably tell from the title, it's going to include some kind of phase shift because it applies to the phase. What this allows you to do is it allows you to dial in the phase shift per frequency. As you can see, we have degrees on one axis and the frequency on the other axis. And I'll quickly put this out of drawing mode so that I just get dots here. And you can see I can just say, okay, for this frequency, say 100 Hertz, I want the phase shift to be negative 360 degrees or one entire cycle. And you can just see that you can create graphs like this, which will apply some kind of phase shift. In this case, this plugin introduces some latency, so I have to correct for that. And you can again see that if I bypass this plugin, no phase shift, and now we have phase shift. So you could use an approach like this where you're just purely focusing on the phase shift. The easiest way that I found to use this plugin is by setting this down and this up. And we want a nice straight line like this. I want to set it to extreme quality because I obviously want the highest possible quality. And then we can tweak the depth amount to get the exact phase shift that we want. And you'll see that you get this very nice looking waveform again, where we're both shifting the sub bass very far back and we're also making again space for the transient itself. Note that we see the sub bass arriving here and that the transient is nice and close to the zero line. Now, of course, you can play around with this graph. You could do something maybe like this, or move it around like that. And with the depth amount, you can set the exact amount of phase shifting that you want. The depth amount is just a multiplier for the actual numbers that you see on this side of the graph. Another plugin that is commonly used, which does the same thing, is Disperser. This is also a phase changer. As you can see here, again, I have to make sure that this is aligned to size scope. In this case, we want this to be forward again. This is actually very important that when you're working on your kick and bass, that you're always looking at the waveform in the correct way and that you align everything. Any kind of plugin that introduces a latency will actually move the waveform around inside of size scope. I believe this is an artifact of the way that Ableton handles plugin delay compensation. So maybe in your DAW this does not have to be the case. There's also other oscilloscopes that may correct for this. I believe Altar of Wisdom has an oscilloscope that actually automatically corrects for this. But you can see that again, you can dial in the phase shift here. As you can see, what was actually happening here was that the phase shift was so high that basically the entire sub bass of this bass note was shifted onto this part here. Of course, you can set the frequency that you want. You can change the way that this graph works. What I would probably do is set the amount a lot lower and just kind of tweak this. Now again, you can see that we get that nice property where the sub bass isn't present here. It is shifted back by at least one oscillation. And you can again see and hear that we get that zappy kind of sound. So really there's two approaches. You have your multiband approach where you use the multiband filters, and you just have your phase shift approach where you have a bunch of different plugins that just purely focus on shifting the phase of the different harmonics after generating the signal, obviously. Later, what we'll look at is directly changing the phase inside of here. There's a cool technique that you can use to generate wavetables that already have the right phase shift in there, but this is something for later in the video. What I want to talk about first is some of the problems that happen when you're processing your bassline. What you may have noticed is that I've been constantly looking at this transient, and you may have wondered why I wasn't looking at this transient here. And now that I'm looking at this transient, you're probably wondering why this transient is different from this one. And this is because of the same effect that is causing the sub-bass to be here. This part also has a sub-bass. So you can just imagine that this sub-bass, if it's shifted back one oscillation, it's going to be at the start right here of this transient here, of this bass note here. Now we look before at the waveform again, and if I zoom in again, what you can see is that for this bassline, what we're doing is we're making it go back to 0, so that then the next transient really has all of the space and all of the punch and all of the power that it needs to really come through and play at its full potential. You don't want any sub-bass smearing out the place where this transient is, not from the bass itself, but also not from the previous bass note. Here's another example of that phenomenon. I've dialed in a little bit of a stronger amount of phase shift with M freeform phase here, and you can see that, again, this transient, it's being pushed a little bit by the sub-bass here. You can see the sub-bass going down, and then this transient being a little bit below the 0 line. I may be able to zoom into it. You can see that this transient here, it's not oscillating around 0 dB, which is right here. It is oscillating around this line, because this line is just kind of continuing into this bass note here. And the same is happening here. Obviously, the effect is much more pronounced because this note is a lot louder, so you can really see that this transient is just being pushed down here, which means that this transient does not have the optimal space to actually play. So what we want, essentially, is a phase shift that shifts our harmonics back in time, but we don't want it to shift back in time into the next bass note. So how will we do that? Is there a way that we can take a process and make it phase shift only in this part here? And in real time, the answer is no. There is no way to do that, at least not that I know of. If there is a way to do that, I would love to know that, because that would solve a lot of different problems for a lot of different producers. The only real way that you're going to have a bassline that is phase shifted like this, but that doesn't really move into the next bass note, is if there is a process of resampling in between. Resampling is a very, very common strategy to fix all of these issues, and actually to fix a lot of different issues. It is to take your bass, create a new audio track, and then you're just going to record one note of the bass line. So we'll zero this out, we'll zero this out, so that we get one note. We get that one note that we have here. This is our recording, and as you can see, the note is again passing by the MIDI clip that we have selected. Remember that we specifically set the volume to stop, so we do see that our bass note is being extended by this phase shifting process. We said to the synth, okay, we want you to stop here with playing, but because of the phase shift, it is continuing to play. I hope that you can see that with the use of compression, this waveform extending beyond where we want it to. So what we can do is we can just remove that part of the waveform. We probably want to add a little bit of a fade to this here, so something like this. And what we can do is also chop this off. You can see that with the particular phase shift that I'm using, we also get something called pre-ringing. This is the reason why there's this long delay in M freeform phase. It is because it needs to bring this waveform in. It needs to phase this waveform in. You can see it going away from the 0 line here. I can make this a little bit higher in volume so that it's easier to see. You can see that the phase shift is already occurring here. What is essentially happening is, again, you cannot go forward in time. So it is introducing a delay in the chain. That's why I again need to compensate for that delay. And then it is shifting the whole waveform except for everything that is happening here. So all of this is being shifted backwards in time, and then that is compensated for by the plugin delay compensation. And that's why you get wiggles in front. Again, you don't really need these wiggles in front of it. You don't really want it. In this case, we don't want them because we just want our individual bass note here, so that we can duplicate this over and duplicate this here as well. We can again lower the volume of the first bass note so that it doesn't compete too much with the kick. We will increase these bass notes here a little bit maybe. And now what you can see is that we just have this waveform here, and because there's no filter anywhere on here, there's no filter here, there's no filter on the group that is in your kick and bass group. If you're using that, there's not going to be a filter on there. There's not going to be any filters on my master chain. That is very important to keep in mind, that even after the resampling, we don't want to reintroduce any kind of filtering. Because again, we don't want to extend this frequency here because we pretty clearly want this transient to come through. And again, if we look into size scope, we'll see that our waveform is going to look nice and clean. In this case, I have to change where this track is getting input from. We obviously want to get input from the audio track because we're no longer using the synthesis part here. And you can see now we have nice transients here. It's nice and cleaned up, and we're also losing the post-ringing that was right here. Now in this clip, you can see the transient being pushed down slightly. This is a side effect of how M freeform phase does the phase shift, and usually what I would do is just set up a configuration in which that doesn't happen. There are certain configurations where the transient is exactly on the silence line, which is what you're aiming for. That's actually very important, that post-ringing that is right here. Because we don't only want to keep the transient of the bass line, we also want to keep the transient of the kick. Let's get back to the kick a little bit. Let's look at where the kick is playing. It's playing right here. What that means is that any post-ringing that is coming from this part here, that is coming from this part below here, if there's any post-ringing that kind of extends this note, it's going to extend it right here where the kick is playing. We don't want that. We don't want that to happen, right? Another thing that we don't want to happen is, say that I am going to EQ my kick a little bit. I'm going to see that there's a little bit of rumble down there. Let's use a high pass here to remove some of that rumble. Look at what's happening to the kick right now. Do you see how the kick is continuing into the part where the bass is supposed to play? Again, looking at where the bass is playing, this is really where the bass is taking over, and this is really where the kick is taking like the majority of the energy. Again, we saw before when we we're looking at the waveforms that right here you see mainly kick drum, and right here you see mainly bass line. So applying that to our synthesis, what we would want is we would want our kick to take over this space here, and we want our bass to take over this space, so the last eighth note of the beat. First eighth note is the kick, last eighth note is the bass. Of course, there's this section where there's the overlap, but for that reason we have lowered the volume here of the bass line. So with our kick example, let's exaggerate that a little bit by just applying it like 3 times. You can see what is happening now. We have a phase shift on the kick that is really messing up what is happening with our bass line, among other problems obviously that come from just duplicating an EQ like this. But you can see that our bass transient is being destroyed by the kick. So what you would want to do, let's say that this is the EQ that you want to apply to your kick. What you would want to do in this case is resample your kick drum. So again, we will take input from our kick here and we will record that. Just one recording should do the trick. And we can Control E down here and we can do something like that, a little fade. And now again, if we set this to the audio track, we should see that that problem area here is going to go away. Our kick is now stopping nicely before the transient so that the transient has maximum space to come through. Now, as I said before, once you've resampled your kick and bass, you really don't want to do any filtering anymore. So what I'm going to do is I'm quickly going to take this size scope and I'm just going to use it to look at the group. So this is going to be the size scope on our kick and bass group. Now, in this case, all of the input is coming through the first one. You say, okay, I've resampled everything. There shouldn't be any problems. Let me now master this track. I am going to master this. I am going to start, I don't know, with a little bit of compression. I'm going to compress, nice. Nice. Okay, let's take another tool. Let's take a maximizer. And oh, I noticed while I was watching this mastering tutorial, by the way, that you need to high pass your master because there's going to be rumble in those very low frequencies. So let me quickly high pass this master. Right, just like 18 Hertz, there's not going to be any useful information down below there. I can just do this. There shouldn't be any problems. Let me, just to be sure, turn off all of the other stuff here. This is just going to be my master chain. Let's see what happens to the kick and bass relationship now. Before, after. Do you see how all of the transients are messed up? How the kick transient is messed up? How this transient, how that stuff is messed up? That's just the high pass doing that. You can see it is shifting, for example, down this transient. It is messing up the cleanliness of this transient and this transient. You really don't want to do that. In this case, there's some extra plugins for the delay, so I'll show it like this as well. Notice how much that messes with the transient. In fact, what can happen in this case is that you're maximizing it before. Say that you're maximizing it here, and you get it to 0 dB so that you get a really nice loud master. Let's make this nice and loud. Really strong, really well mastered, you know, everything. But then because of the phase shift that happens right here, you're going to actually exceed 0 dB, exceed the limit that you want to master to. Because of the phase shift, it is changing the waveform in a way that it now peaks higher. You might say, oh, okay, then I'll do this like this, where I'm phase shifting before it, but that still doesn't fix the issue of your transient actually being messed up. So we know that we don't want to EQ after resampling, right? We have pretty clearly established that, and we also know that resampling is important. So we know that at some point, you're going to have your kick and bass, you're going to finalize your kick and bass, you're going to turn it into audio, and then you cannot really change it much, unless you use this trick. Here I have another EQ, and you might say, well, this is going to cause massive phase shift. As you can see, we're using a high pass filter, which, as we saw before, introduces massive amounts of phase shift, especially in the low frequencies, which is obviously going to change the waveform a lot more than the high frequencies. But let's see what happens to the waveform if I turn on this EQ. Well, that's strange. It isn't actually phase shifting. It is applying this EQ. We can see that some of the low frequencies are dampened by this like high pass filter here, but it's not phase shifting. You can see that this kind of remains the same. This remains the same. We're not getting that really smooshed out kick transient. This transient is still looking nice. This transient is still looking nice. What's going on here? Well, this is something called linear phase. And linear phase, what it means is that what essentially happens is we're phase shifting still in the same way, in the sense that all of the frequencies around the filter gets shifted backwards in time, but then it compensates by also shifting everything else back in time. So what that means is that this plugin here is phase shifting everything equally. So you just get your same exact waveform back. We're still phase shifting everything technically, but the waveform is compensated for, so we actually don't get the negative side effects of phase shifting. The negative effects that we do get is latency. When it comes to latency, you can see that this is almost a second of latency. And in fact, if you look at this in when I press play versus when it starts to play, you can see and hear that like there's a little bit of a desync in here. In fact, there's a desync of almost a second. You can see M freeform phase is already introducing some latency. It's written down below here. We have 185.8 milliseconds, but the linear phase EQ that we're using here is 743 milliseconds. So together we almost have a second of delay in here, which is really annoying when you're producing like this kind of delay. Anytime you press play, you just want it to go instantly. Another problem that arises with this is that we're not removing like all of the problems. There is still a little bit of ringing. What ringing is in this case is when we're applying this phase shift, we're not just changing the phase. It also tends to be the case that the frequencies around where we phase shift the most get extended a little bit. They get extended by maybe an oscillation, maybe half an oscillation, something like that. So not very far, unless you're talking about like the sub bass. But what really happens when we are shifting all of the other frequencies back into phase, which is what the linear phase is doing, is that we leave a little bit of that original frequency that we're actually filtering in front of it. So you're going to get something called pre-ringing. And what pre-ringing does in our case, in our practical case, is that you can see it here. It's not exactly around the zero line like we decided upon here. If you look at this waveform goes down to zero at the end here. This waveform does not go down to zero there. We look at this, it goes up, and then we get this like strange click happening here, and there's some weird stuff happening here now, which is actually caused by the pre-ringing. Here, there's actually a very good example of the pre-ringing. You can just see that this waveform, it goes up into our transient. What happens in this case, especially when you're doing this kind of pre-ringing early on in the chain, when you're doing this early on in your processing chain, for example, right after your resampling and before you go into your actual master chain. In this case, it is after the actual like mastering of this kick and bass. But if you do it before, the mastering chain is really going to exaggerate that problem. So there is this negative side effect that it can smear out the transients so that it can like almost like whip the transient. The transient is no longer like a clear click, but it's like a swoosh. We don't necessarily want that to be the case. So in that case, I do recommend if you want to EQ it, you can use linear phase, but try to stick to one linear phase plugin maximum. And if you can get away with not doing it, if you can get away with just going back, redoing it in the kick and bass synthesis part and then resampling again, then that's a lot better for your kick and bass actually. So at this point, we have both our kick and our bass processed and cleaned up, but there's a lot more that you can actually do. What we'll start with is looking a little bit at the groove. There's some interesting things that happen when you start to play around with the volume of these individual notes. I can do that in here. For example, if I lower this volume a little bit, what you'll find is that there's more importance on this bass note because it's louder, and therefore you get more strength towards the offbeat than towards this note, which gives it a nice kind of two-step groovy feeling. You can hear that as I lower the volume, you get this tighter focus on the offbeat. Another thing that we can change is the volume of this note here. And right now we have this note set very, very low. This is for a very good reason, which we looked at before. We don't actually want this to influence too much the trajectory of this sine wave of the kick here. But it does feel like this note is getting a little bit kind of compressed and put out of the way of the kick. And maybe that's not really the feeling that we want to go for. So let's try turning that up again. So this is a very exaggerated example and I would normally not put it this high, but you can hear that we get a more kind of sustained and symmetrical rhythm. This is really what we want to get with the rolling kick and bass, because obviously we want to kind of introduce that trance-like feeling in the listener. And in order to do that, you want to have kind of like a stable rhythm going on. So this first bass note can cause some quite big issues, and we can actually completely fix that by using something called a gallop bassline. It will become apparent why it's called that in a little bit. But the way that you do that is you just completely disable this note, so this note is no longer playing. And you can see that we're getting this nice galloping kind of rhythm. This rhythm tends to sound a little bit more aggressive, and I found that it works a little bit better with more aggressive styles of psytrance. I'm not saying aggressive in the kind of aggressiveness that is usually kind of associated with dark psy or forest or like the faster kinds of psytrance. I'm more saying in when the subject matter of the track is aggressive and when the sound design of the track is aggressive. Some very distorted sounds, some very heavy FM sounds, stuff like that. Then this kind of kick and bass tends to work very well. The reason I think why this works very well is because in this case, as you can see, the kick is completely clean. You can ignore this little part here because this is an error with the playback within PsyScope. The reason why this shows up in PsyScope is because the command to stop playing from the DAW gets to PsyScope a little bit later than when the sound actually stops playing from the signal chain before it. So anytime you pause it, you get these little parts where it's just silent. But let's say that you don't want this galloping kind of sound. Maybe this is not the rhythm that you want to go for. Maybe you do want that extra note in there to get a more stable rhythm. What can we do to make it fit in there better? As you can see right now, this is a problem because it messes up this waveform completely. Well, ideally what we would want is for the sub-bass of this bass sound to line up with the sub-bass of the kick itself. And the reason why we would want that is because then it is easier to sum them together. As you can see right now, what is happening here is that when this waveform is going up, this waveform is going down. Here it's very extreme where it's going up, this one is going down. Where it's going down here, this one is going up. And here again, as you can see, it's going up and this is going down. So what will actually happen here is that these two waveforms will sum together to a very low volume. They will cancel out. Whereas with other parts, for example here, this spike together with this spike here will become this very massive boost. And in fact, in the summing, we can see this boost right here. And we can see that what is essentially happening to our bass line and our kick together here is that we don't get this kind of nice continuous sine wave anymore. Now you really want that nice continuous sine wave. This is really something to look for, because what you want when it comes to like your low frequency is that you want a nice clean sub bass. That is the way that you get very strong power out of your bass line and the low frequencies in your mix. You don't want this to be all wobbly, you want it to be a nice, pure, clean sine wave. Obviously, the volume that we set is going to have influence on it. As I said before, this is maybe a little bit too high of a volume for this bass note. So let's maybe try 0 dB here. Already it's looking more like a sine wave, but there is something else that we can try to make it even better. What I'm going to do is I'm going to phase shift just the sub bass. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to go back into the patch itself. So let's actually go back into the patch. The way that I'm going to do this temporarily is I'm going to create 2 groups so that I don't have to switch every time. I'm just going to set this to the first group and this to the second group. So now we have essentially a kick group here, and then we have a bass group here. In fact, let me quickly name all of these tracks. So as you can see now, we're back at the old situation where we have our messed up transients here, just because we are using a non-resampled bass line. But what we want to do is we want to add one extra plugin. Now there's a few different plugins that allow you to do this, but the best way that you can do it, in my opinion, is PHA 979. This is by Voxengo. And what you'll see here is that you have this phase here. And this is just going to be the phase of the sub bass, which is really, really nice. It's just going to isolate the lowest harmonic and it allows you to phase shift just that. As I was moving this parameter around, you could probably see that there was just this one sine wave kind of moving back and forth in between the waveform. And you could see all of the rest of the spikes and troughs kind of moving around that one sine wave, which was moving bass and forth. That is the sub bass moving back and forth while the rest stays at the exact same phase that you want. So here what we can do is we can look at it in layers mode. Again, what I will do is I'll just go quickly into the MIDI so that I can up the volume a little bit so that we have an easier way of seeing it. I could also somewhere turn up, yes, the zoom here so that we can see it a bit better. Sorry for the random audio cutouts. I'm using the demo version of this plugin, as you can see, and that causes sometimes the audio just to be muted. The reason for that is I don't actually use this plugin in day-to-day production. I have a different method of phase alignment, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Now, as you can see, this plugin goes from minus 90 degrees to 90 degrees, so it cannot do a full 180 degrees either way phase rotation or a full 360 degrees phase rotation. It's either 360 degrees or 180 degrees either way. It does have this option though, where you just flip the waveform upside down. And you can see that with the waveform just flipped upside down like this, in this case, it already lines up pretty neatly here, right here, especially towards the end here. What we could do is move this back a little bit. I can hold Control to influence both the left and the right parameter together. And as you can see, now we have aligned our kick to the bass. Now what you'll see is that we're still getting these big spikes. We have all of this little rumble here, but the main sine wave is kind of staying in there. You can see that now this one continuous sine wave is still kind of in here. Obviously it's being bent with whatever else the bass line is doing in terms of the rest of the waveform. But because the sub bass of the bass and the kick are lined up, you're going to get this almost sine wave-like waveform. Now what we're doing here is called phase alignment. You shouldn't confuse it with just general phasing, what we've been talking about before, which you're doing with the processing. This is another step that you're using to basically increase the harmony between the kick and the bass. Essentially, in this case, we're making sure that they work well together, and we're not just looking at the tonality of the bass line, although doing phase alignment is technically changing the tonality of the bass line as well. So now that it's phase aligned, we can do our resampling again. So we'll just get one note and we'll just quickly record this. We just get something like this here and we delete the rest. Let's hit Ctrl J here to consolidate it into a new file. The reason why you would do that is so that you can set it to 0 dB exactly. And then we can just duplicate it over. Now by setting it to 0 dB here, there's a cool thing that you can do, and that is essentially you can basically set a relative volume here. How much do you want this bass note to be quieter than the rest of the bass? Obviously, we have just massively increased the volume of the bass, so we're going to need to compensate for that in a little bit. As you can clearly hear and see in the waveform. But for now, we can just talk about relative volume. So let's try something like -6, and I'll quickly lower this also a little bit. And now you get something like this. That would be probably a nice volume level for the bassline with respect to the kick actually. And you can see that doing this, again, as I said before, our sine wave is respected here. And now we also have a clean kick and bass again. Now there is a different method of doing this, which is the one that I actually preferred. In the method of phase alignment that we've seen right now, what the big problem is the sub basses clashing. So what we could do is we could just remove the sub bass from the bass notes that actually play with the kick together. The way that I like to do that is I'll again make group and I'll just duplicate this bass over here. Let's remove the phase alignment tool that we've been using so far here because we no longer need it for this method. We just want our synthesis and our processing. And then on this one extra bass note, which we're going to place here for now, the way that I actually like to do it is like this, so that you can resample it instantly in a beat. But within this secondary patch that we have now made, we are just going to go into Serum and we are going to remove the bass note right here. So this is going to be the lowest harmonic removed. Therefore, we no longer have a sub bass. The way that we're doing this in here is actually fairly important because we're not changing the phase of any of the other harmonics. If you were to use a filter, of course, you would change the phase, and therefore your main bass note would have a different phasing and therefore a different tone than the bass notes playing on the kick. Now, as you can hear, we have a version of the bass with a sub bass and a version of the bass without a sub bass. And we can just resample these. Again, because we're resampling, all we have to do is just kind of chop this up. I'll delete this. And I'll give equal fades like this. There and there. And one of the things that you'll notice is that the volume of this note is right now peaking at 11.9, negative 11.9. Whereas this one is a little bit lower at negative 12.6, which is often something that you'll see. Now again, what I like to do is just set both of them to 0 dB and then determine my relative volume later. So what I'll do is I'll paste one over here and let's set this to, for example, -7. And what you will get now is that you don't really have to phase align it anymore towards the sub. You can phase align it in a different way. Obviously, you cannot phase align it to the sub because we have just removed the sub. But what this allows us to do is a very neat trick where we preserve the transient a little bit more. In this case, what we can do is if we look at the kick, it is actually a fairly good case because this bass transient is not playing on top of this peak. This peak is coming in a little bit later. Ideally, what I would want is I would like to have this transient kind of play right here at the zero crossing of this waveform going from negative volume to positive volume. All of the points where the line crosses from the waveform either from positive to negative or from negative to positive is called the zero crossing. Now there's a few things that we could do. For one, what we would like to do is we would like to align this to the grid. Now in this case, I don't think that this is misaligned from the grid. I think that I've just misaligned my size scope here. We need to verify that, of course. It is actually back a little bit. So maybe let's move it forward a little bit. Maybe this is also going to have the same problem. Yes, it will. So we will just remove a little bit of the initial part here. Let's also make sure that this has a very slight fade into the transient. We'll do the same right here. Very slight fade. And then we'll duplicate this over to the last part here. Right now, what I would recommend, as you can see, we have these little gaps in here. If you're aligning it like this, where you want the transient to exactly line up with kind of the grid, with where the rhythm is supposed to play. If we set this to 16 notes, as you can see, this is where we want to line it up. Here we have one, here we have one, and here we have one, and we want our bass notes to have their transients exactly lined up to that space. And of course, we want our kick to be lined up to the first part of the beat. But now that we have this, as you can see, there's a little hole here. What can become a problem is if you start duplicating this kick and bass, that you're misaligning it over time, because maybe you're doing something like this and hitting duplicate and then duplicate. As you can see, the misalignment becomes more and more and more. Obviously, we don't want that. So what I'll quickly do is just select this, consolidate again. And here, just select this, consolidate again. And now I can just duplicate this over, and now I'm sure that it's going to be aligned to the note because it exactly has the length of a note. Another tip that I can give you is to record your kicks like this, where you're actually using your entire beat for the kick, because when you're duplicating your kick, this way it will always stay on the beat. I actually had to remake this kick a little bit because I want to show what happens when this is exactly lined up with the top here. So having a look at our side scope, what we can see now is that when we zoom into where the peak is, we can see that our transient is kind of extending out of this peak, something that, again, we don't really want because we want our transient to have the maximum amount of space possible. So what we can do when synthesizing our kick, let's go back into the synthesis part here, is we can actually use the negative side effects of a filter in our advantage here. In this case, we're phase aligning the kick to the bass. In the last case, we were phase aligning the bass to the kick. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to enable this filter right here, and we're going to play, and we're just going to tweak the filter until we get the transient to be nicely close to the zero crossing or to the zero line here. Let's record this. And now obviously we want to make sure that we are fading out here. Make sure that we go to zero again. And we just consolidate like this. And now if we zoom out, you can again see that we have maximum space for transient. We again have this nice continuous sine wave going in here all the way to the end. We are again dealing with a few peaks in here and a few kind of alterations to this main waveform here. That's always going to be the case, unless you use the galloping bassline rhythm, which I talked about before, where you just remove the bass note completely. This bass note is going to change the waveform, so it's never going to be a perfect sine wave. You just want to get very, very close to it, which in this case we have achieved. This is looking a little bit ugly, but I think it will be okay. And the other thing that we could potentially do is just maybe lower this volume a little bit more. The rhythm is still there, we still have a nice click, but you can see that it's going to kind of diminish the impact of the bass note, obviously, on the look of the waveform. So that's the two different methods of phase alignment that I know of. There might be more methods. Again, in this case, there's maybe more information out there that I just don't know about, more methods that I don't know about, but this is everything that I know. What we're going to do now is we're going to dive deeper into the advanced topics. Up until this point, you'll probably have seen this in other tutorials, but from this point on, I really want to dive into kind of the very technical and the very deep stuff that you might not have considered when creating your bass lines. There's also going to be some creative stuff, which I'll tackle on at the end, where I'm going to be talking about things like layering. And then we'll also have a look at making some different bassline types. As I said before, I want to do an offbeat bass, I want to do some slide basses, and I just want to give you a general overview of how you create some different bass sounds. Depending on how much time I have left at that point, I also want to talk a little bit about rhythms maybe. To be honest, there's just so much to talk about that I don't know how long this video is going to go. I don't want to make it too long. I'm kind of aiming for like 3 hours or something like that. I know that's sounding long already, but when it comes to the amount of stuff that I can talk about when it comes to kick and bass, that's really not that long, to be honest. So let's dive into the more technical side of things. Up until this point, what we have all done is kind of, as I said before, very standard ways of creating kick and bass. But there are obviously a lot of negatives to this. The whole idea of having to resample your kick and bass is a bit limiting in the sense that I cannot go back and just change the pitch of certain notes if I want to do a bass melody. What I would have to do is recreate the melody in MIDI, make sure that I have every note that I want to use isolated. Then I resample all of those notes. And then what I want to do is I just want to recreate that in audio. So you would have to take your resample bass and you would have to see like, okay, here I'm going to need the bass in F, and here I'm going to need the bass in, I don't know, G sharp or something like that. So you have to go look at where you have all of those notes, where you have all of the resampled versions of those bass lines, and you just have to kind of put them together at any point where you need the different notes. So ideally, we would like to not have to resample, but in order to not have to resample, we would need to make sure that the phasing kind of happens before the volume envelope. As I said before, the big problem with having phasing and doing all of this kind of processing the way that we're doing it and phase shifting everything is that this volume envelope is not respected, right? We're pushing stuff, we're pushing the waveform kind of past where we wanted to cut off, as we have seen right here. Now, what wouldn't work is something like this, where you go into your bassline and you say after the processing, oh, I'll go in here and I'll go to something like add a photo and I'll just create something like a 16 note on here that will just set up like this. Maybe we want our envelope again to look something like this, and then we'll go down. You might say like, oh, wouldn't this just like work? Doesn't this give us the volume shape that we want? Well, it does give us the shape that we want. What will still happen is that if we're post-stringing into the next note, that post-stringing isn't being taken care of. So what we really need is we need to have our phasing in front of the initial volume envelope. Now that sounds very, very technical, but what it essentially means is that this waveform that we see here, this saw wave, already needs to have the phasing kind of embedded into it. Now, to give you an example of what that might look like, I want to direct your attention to, for example, the saw waves category in here. Here I have this wavetable here, freeform phase, saw processing normalized. Now, this wavetable comes from my Wavetable spec, which you'll be able to find on my Gumroad if you want to use it yourself. And what this is the processing that we see in here, kind of this line up in here. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to set a certain depth via the wavetable position. As you can see, this changes the amount of phasing that is happening in here. And this is equal to just changing the depth in this plugin. But obviously right now we have it in wavetable format. Now there's actually other wavetables that you can use. I want to quickly also shout out my friend MindB, who made a whole bunch of different Psy wavetables. As you can see, this has that same kind of phasing, kind of punchy look to it that we're aiming for. And you can see that you have a whole bunch of different options here. There's actually a standard wavetable that comes with Serum, the Icon Has Kick wavetable, that also has this phasing look to it. I would recommend something like right here could work fine for a bassline. But let's say that none of those wavetables actually work for you. How can you make your own, and how can you embed the processing that you usually use on your bassline into a wavetable like this? What I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly create a new track so that we're starting from scratch, and I'm going to load up another Serum. This is going to be just generating the saw wave. I'm just going to zoom out a bit because we're going to need a clip length of like 2 bars here. And what I want to do is I want to play a note in C1. Now, this is something that I've experimented with when I was making my own wavetables. What you really need is you need a standardized method. You need a standardized length that you're using, and you need a standardized note. What I like to do is I like to use a low note, because for lower notes, the oscillations are going to be longer because they play at a lower frequency. And what that means essentially when it comes to wavetable creation is that you're going to have a higher quality wavetable because each cycle is going to have more samples. And in this case, I'm not talking about samples as in kick samples, but the samples that are used to create waveforms. Again, this is not meant to be a like basics to sound design course, but I think we all know that if you zoom into a waveform, it's actually made out of individual points, which represent where the waveform is supposed to be at any point in time. These are called samples. So with this saw wave, what we can do is we can process it a little bit. Let's apply some processing. In this case, I'll just go for some multiband processing for this example, because that's what probably most of you are going to use. And I'm going to do this, maybe this, and I guess I'll duplicate it over a bit, do something a little bit different. I'm kind of just doing this at random. Obviously, what you would normally do is you would create your bassline and then process it with this. And then you would take your processing and put it on a saw wave like we're doing here. So let's say that you have your bassline made and you want to clean it up, not in the traditional method of resampling. What you would do is you would just take the processing from your bass and just put it on a saw wave. In this case, what I've done is I've just taken an oscilloscope so that we can quickly verify that the waveform kind of looks the way that we want it to. And you can see we again have that kind of wavy property. So now let's turn this into a wavetable. I'm going to record this and we'll do just like this. We will delete this part here and I'm going to crop clips. This is needed inside of Ableton, in particular this crop clips method, because Ableton doesn't actually make files available to plugins or other programs unless you do this. So now we can just take this file and we can drag it into an oscillator and you'll see that we get a nice looking wavetable. When we look at the first part though, you can see that there's a little bit of a problem. It is a little bit unstable at the first part. Part of this has to do with the fact that maybe there's a little bit of an attack to the waveform, but also part of this has to do with the phasing. Again, the reason why you see no sub-bass here is because the sub-bass is being shifted more than one cycle. If we go to maybe the cycle number 2, it's starting to appear, the sub-bass is starting to appear here, and then like at cycle around like cycle 6, it's going to stabilize. Obviously, as you can see, there's different small differences in here. There's never going to be fully accurate like importing. The reason for that is because we're taking something that is sampled at one sample rate and we're essentially turning this into a different sample rate. Inside of Serum, each wave cycle is using 2048 samples. And I don't know what is being used inside of here, but converting to whatever is used inside of this file for each cycle, the amount of samples that create one cycle is going to differ from the amount of cycles that are used for this wavetable here. So obviously there's a little bit of an error importing. What you just do is you just choose one of them. In this case, let's go for this one kind of at random. And then right here, you can add remove all except selected. And now we're left with the wavetable that we can use for a bassline. So we'll turn this off. We'll assign this to the volume. We'll assign oscillator B to the filter so that it goes through the filter. Let's turn off the processing and we'll also delete the LFO tool. And what I want to do now is I want to generate the no sub version. So I'm just going to take this, paste it over here. You don't actually see that it changes, but if I open up the patch, you can see that we have the same patch on the no sub version. And for there, I just remove the sub bass. One of the things that I forgot is to assign the velocity here. So I'll quickly do that. We go to velocity here and I'll do the same with this one. Velocity. And now in here, I can change the velocity however I want. And now we can see that we get this processed looking bassline, but it's looking also like we've resampled it as it's going to 0 here. It's leaving our transient intact, it's leaving the other transients intact, and everything is looking nice. There are a few things that we might want to change though. We might want to have this phase actually lined up with the transient or right before the transient here, or like that click part of the wave cycle. Let's do the same here. This is maybe a little bit annoying. Again, what you could also do is make all of the edits in this patch that you want. You just then copy it over to the other patch here. And then you'll be presented with another version of Serum where you can just remove the sub bass. So now we have a bassline created by wavetables. And wavetable basslines really is kind of almost like a new concept, I guess, in Psytrance. I've only really seen it in like the last 2 to 3 years, I would say, ever since I started doing tutorials. When I started doing tutorials, there weren't any tutorials out there explaining this stuff. And I guess myself, through experimentation, I kind of learned this. But since then, and maybe even at the same time or even before that, I have seen some tutorials that actually use a wavetable to create your, like, the main tonality of the bassline so that you don't actually have to process it, so that you don't have to resample it afterwards. There is a little bit of a problem though. As you can see, all of the wave cycles look the same. We have our phased look to it, but we have lost the property of our sub bass kind of coming in late. Now, for the longest time, I thought that this wasn't really a big deal. I thought that this was just a better approach anyway, because what that would mean is that you would have more sub overall, because the sub bass is playing now throughout the whole waveform, as opposed to just like this part over here, like the final part over here. So I thought like, okay, you get a nicer, more stable bass sound out of this. But what I found is that this makes the bass sound very static sounding. It doesn't have a lot of dynamics to it, if you will. Now, fairly recently, I actually found a fix for this. The way that you can do this is, what I can do is I can go in here, remove the sub bass from here, and we can use a different oscillator to provide the sub bass. Let's take basic shapes right here. Again, we want to ideally look at the waveform while we're doing this kind of stuff. And you can see that now we have the same volume envelope for both of them. We're just using LFO 2 for both of them. I'm actually going to change that, and I'm going to set this to LFO 3. What we can now do is just by holding Alt, move this to LFO 3 so that we have the same shape. And then what we'll do is we'll make the sub bass come in a little bit later. Now, as you can see, one of the things that happened is that we're changing the phase here. So this is no longer in the same phase than the sub bass was before. So we need to change that maybe. And maybe also it just has too much sub bass at this point. So we'll turn that down a little bit. So now, as you can see, we have the shape that we want back, in the sense that the sub bass isn't coming in until a little bit later, giving us just a little bit more dynamics, a little bit more life to our bass line. But the other cool thing that we can do is we can take this concept, the no sub bass and the bass part, and basically reduce that back to one patch. It is very annoying having to just play with two different patches, and the only difference being is that you remove the sub bass from one of them. What we can do is we can just move this over here and then use another LFO to determine when this actually opens up and when it closes. Now, in order to do that, we need a shape that looks somewhat like this, where what I've done is I've just made like this square shape where the modulation is only going up for the second half of the beat in this case. And I'm just moving this back a little bit. I'll probably also want to move this a little bit back as well, so that obviously this goes down again, and we're again making sure that there's nothing happening when the kick is going to play. And now we can just set this to the auxiliary, which, no, we can't, because this is already in use. So how would you do this? There's actually a cool trick that we can do. Let's go into the Wavetable editor, and we'll remove all of the other wavetables for now. What we essentially want to do is we want to morph between this waveform and silence. So we'll just do something like this, and then we'll go add remove. Oh, sorry, morph crossfade. Let's move this one in front of the other one, if that's possible, like so. And now we can crossfade. So our sine wave is the last part here. And what we can do now is we can just set this like so. Let's quickly verify that this doesn't actually have a sub bass in here. I'll make this a little bit bigger. And you can see that we have a main sine oscillation sitting in here, which is not sitting in here. There's not one of those big main sine spikes in here, which we can see in these last two notes. So right now we're still doing the same thing as we did before, where we have the separated sub. We're just doing it all in one patch, which just makes things easier to edit. And overall, I think that this is where bassline creation for Psytrance is going to go into the future. I think that this is the method that most people will adopt as this method becomes more popular and more widespread and more well known, because I just think that this is the best and the most superior method for getting both very clean kick and bass lines and very dynamic, very nice sounding kick and bass lines without having the need to resample. Because the cool thing that I can do now is I can just start playing to create maybe some melodies. Let's go to perfect fifth here. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This is not going to be about music theory. I might talk a little bit about making melodies for your bass lines and the different melody tricks that I like to use, but I'm nowhere near experienced enough to actually talk about the music theory behind bass melodies. For now, I just want to show you what it looks like if you're making a melody in this, and you will see that it's still very nice and very clean. And you can in fact see that this bass note is actually going up in pitch. Now, obviously, there are some other techniques that you could do. Let's take, for example, this note here, and I'm actually going to duplicate this patch because we are going to edit it quite a bit for what we're about to do. Let's just increase kind of the length of this note for now. We're going to make it nice and long, because what this allows us to do is create a very long note. Maybe let's go like a quarter note. I want to go maybe something like this. I still want a very spiky envelope. I want this to be a quarter note. I want this to be a quarter note, and this we can turn off. We don't really want that. We'll just keep this up like that. We'll modify this to make it work. What we get now is we get something like this, where we just have this kind of extended bass note. And what you could do is you could resample this. And you essentially just get this very long bass notes that you can play with. The problem that we're trying to solve here is this. Let's say that you wanted to do bass melodies just like we did here, and you want to turn this up by 7 semitones. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Either you're going to have to warp it. As you can see, I just turned off the warp kind of intuitively because you never really want to warp your bass sound. You can imagine that the warping algorithm is just going to completely destroy the tonality and the stability of the sub bass and all of that kind of stuff. It even messes with stuff like the transient because it really wasn't designed for that. But if you don't warp it, you can see what happens. We lose a lot of space. This bass note could have played all the way up until here, but because we're pitching it up, we're playing it back faster, it actually covers less space. But with a bass note like this, you're going to be all good because all that you have to do is just maybe like pitch it up like this. And you'll still see that you'll be able to just place it wherever you want because a 16 note is going to be this length and whatever pitch that you're using is going to fall in there. Now, obviously, in this case, something that did happen if we look at the normal bass is that I would say that this is a little bit too long. The sub bass is coming in a little bit too late. So we would need to fix that in order to actually use this patch. So maybe let's set this maybe somewhere here. So now that we have our final bass for this method, what we can do is we can just grab it, Control C, and we'll paste it. Let's paste it in here. Obviously, when you're using this method, this does have a sub bass, so it's not going to work for this bass note here. What you really don't want to do, by the way, is mixing different methods. You don't want to use one kind of like resampling or bass creation method with another one here. You really want your bass line to be all made in the same method. So in this case, what I would need to do is I would need to render out another one of these without a sub bass, like we've talked about before. But in this case, you do have the liberty of being able to pitch it up to wherever you want. Something like this. And then you're going to have a bass sound like this. And again, you can tweak this however you want. Let's set this back to 0 to get the same melody that we had before. And what you'll notice that using this technique, what we have currently achieved is almost the same bass line in terms of tonality, but the filter envelope is still a little bit more open than we have in this patch here. And that's just because when you're extending a patch like this, you have to keep into account that all of the envelopes are going to be longer. And obviously that means that you have to compensate for that with the envelope shape that you set up, which I already tried to do, but obviously it can be a little bit more. There is a big problem with this method that comes from changing the pitch of the bass note, and that is that you're essentially changing the envelope length for different pitches. Now this might be an effect that you're going for, but I would say that in 95% of the cases, this is not something that you want. So be careful when you're applying this method that you're aware of that problem. Personally, I never use this method for my bass creation, and I think other methods are far superior. Now there's even more ways of doing this. There's a few people that recommend using multi-samplers and creating your own multi-sample of your own bass line. To be honest, I don't really get that method, why you would go through all of the trouble of doing that. It just seems kind of like a waste of time for me. But I only really have ever heard that of Bitwig users, so that would explain why that would be the case. So I guess these are all of the methods then that you can use to create your bass line and clean it up and make sure that you have a clean bass line. As I said before, I personally recommend the Wavetable method for anybody that would get into making your own bass lines. That is the easiest way to do that. Again, all you have to do for that, if you're already making your own bass lines, is to just take your processing, apply that to a saw wave, and use that as the wavetable for your starting bass. And depending on if you want a more dynamic bass or you want a more static bass, you can implement that sub bass method where you separate the sub bass and give it a different envelope. And personally, that will be the method that I'll be using. Anyway, from this point on, I really want to talk about a whole bunch of different things that aren't really in order. Up until this point, everything that we've kind of done has been almost in order. I would say that maybe that last little bit where I showed you that you can just make a longer bass note is a little bit out of order in this video. Maybe I'll put it somewhere else. I don't really know yet. But right now I want to go over a whole bunch of different tangents that I want to talk about. I want to talk about stereo processing. I want to talk about layering. I also want to come back to the kick at some point. I want to go a little bit more in depth on kick synthesis and the processing and stuff like that. And I want to do that at the hand of a different project actually. So everything from this point is no longer going to be in kind of like a standard order in which you would work like through the creation and processing of your bassline. So let's start by looking at layering. What we can do let's quickly just put this back in the same melody, is we can layer our bass line with something else. We can in fact also layer our kick with something else. Again, I'm going to focus on kick synthesis in a different segment, so I'll discuss it then. But when it comes to bass lines, there's really only one type of layer that I recommend that you add to your bass line. There's a lot of people that want to experiment a lot, and I get that. That is a lot of fun. But to be honest, it most of the time doesn't really result in a nice sounding bass line. The reason for that is because you're going to have all of the phasing issues and phase alignment issues multiplied by 100 if you start adding layers to it. So really the only layer that I would recommend using is something like a stereo layer. What you can do with a stereo layer is you can take the bass line that you have and you can just filter out a particular section. What I like to do is use very shallow filters for this. Obviously we want the least amount of phase shift possible. This is going to introduce a little bit of a phase shift, but as you can see, we're really only considering kind of the mid-range here. So the phase shift is going to be so minimal that it doesn't actually cause a problem. So right now we have the mid-range here. Maybe we'll take something like that. And then what we want to do is we want to generate some stereo with. I'm going to be using M Stereo Sped here. This is a nice stereo processor. I'm going to be talking about stereo processing in a little bit separately, also by like stereo processing your main bassline, which is also an option. But you can hear that we now get the stereo version of the mid-range of our bassline. What we would like though is to just have the stereo width here. We don't actually want a mono component to it because the mono component is going to be completely provided by the actual bass patch, by the bass patch itself. This is a layer, so we don't really want to interfere with what is already being generated by our main bass patch. That is the main reason why I don't personally recommend doing a lot of layering, as often there's issues with layers clashing with your main bass patch, which obviously you don't want. In this particular case, we are using a completely stereo layer and a completely mono main bass patch, so we are not going to have those issues. In order to do that, you can use a plugin like MSAT here, and you can use a mid-mute. What you don't want to do is say, for example, take a Unity and just crank the width up all the way. This doesn't really work in the same way. This actually leaves a little bit of mono component, even I think at 400%. Because if the width is 0, when it's mono, 400% times 0 is still going to be 0. So we actually just want to completely mute the mid component of this channel right here, which is what we're doing with this plugin. If you've been watching this video on the phone, I've just played the stereo component and you shouldn't be able to hear anything because most phones are actually mono. And we can check that this no longer has a mono component if we actually sum it to mono, and then nothing should play. As you can see, the signal gets up until here and then we make it mono. So we sum the stereo sounds together into one channel, and because we only have stereo information, there is no mono information, it's actually going to collapse into silence. But this gives us a stereo component that we can use for our bassline. And as you can see, you can shape it however you want. You can make it as loud as you want, as quiet as you want. Maybe you just want this to be a little bit of a detail. In that way, I would say that you can probably turn it down. Something like this maybe. But if you really are after a more aggressive stereo fields, then obviously you just turn up the volume. Again, this is going to depend on the preference and the actual bassline that you're after. Now, as I said before, there are people that like to layer a lot. I recommend against that. Usually the kind of problem that you're trying to solve with layering can be better achieved by just changing your main patch. The only reason why you would do this stereo layer in particular is because there are some problems by stereonizing your main bassline. But when it comes, for example, to something like a click layer or a gritty layer, it is much easier to just implement that into the patch itself than to generate another layer on top of your patch that you then have to phase align and clean up and make sure that works from a technical standpoint. So for that reason, I recommend not to use too many layers. Now, if you don't even want to use the stereo layer for your bassline and you just want to do some stereo processing, that is also possible. For one, what you could do is do it before the resampling. What you cannot really do is do it before the wavetable creation. If you're using a wavetable bass like this, these wavetables are going to be mono, so you cannot use really kind of your traditional stereoizing method before you're generating the wavetable and actually imprint that stereo information in the wavetable. Now, stereo processing is a whole other can of worms, and I've in fact made a deep dive into stereo processing as well. I don't want to spend another 20 minutes kind of recapping that same video. What you do need to know is that there's a few requirements that you need in order for the stereo processing to actually work. First of all, it's going to be the tone of the stereo processor that you're using. And in this case, what I mean by stereo processor is any plugin that takes a mono signal and turns it into a stereo signal. Up until this point, this bassline has been completely mono. We don't have to verify that because we have made it that way. There hasn't been any sound design process in here that has made this stereo. If we had used something like a hyper here, or the dimension effect, or maybe like a chorus or whatever, then we would be talking about the stereo bassline already. Or maybe if we were using two voices here with a little bit of detune, in that case you would also have a stereo bassline. But we're using none of that, so this is just going to be a completely mono patch. So if we want to get a little bit of stereo field out of our bassline, we do need to process it with a plugin that actually generates stereo wave from a mono sound source. And there's actually a good reason why you would want to do this, why you would want to stereoize your main bassline. The reason for that is, for one, it just tends to be a little bit more exciting, and there are actually plugins that allow you to stereoize a signal without losing any mono compatibility. Some cool plugins that you can use for that are stuff like M Stereo Generator, as well as M Stereo Spread, which is one that I've shown before. You can also use the wider plugin. This also collapses into mono, as it's called, in the sense that when you take the stereo generated sound and you sum it to mono, it's going to be a perfect mono representation of whatever was happening in input. For those that don't know, the side signal or the stereo signal really is determined by the difference between the left and the right channel. If the left channel and the right channel is exactly the same, it's going to be mono. Any difference between the left and the right channel is going to be stereo information. What happens kind of psychoacoustically is that our brain picks up on those even tiniest differences, and it's going to say like, hey, what I'm hearing in the left ear is different from what I'm hearing in the right ear. So this must be a very wide sounding sound. This sound must happen kind of at the extremities of my head. There's a fun experiment that you can do when you're listening on headphones, and that is just to listen to a track, just maybe drag a track into your DAW and just make it mono. Take a stereo track and make it mono. And notice what happens kind of psychoacoustically with the sound where it kind of exists. In your mind, it's going to sound like the mono version of the track is sounding right here in the middle of your head. It sounds like the sounds are playing in between your ears. Whereas stereo information is going to sound like it's coming from outside of your head. Obviously with panning, this is very obvious because the difference is going to be if you, for example, hard pan something to the left, that the sound is only playing in the left ear and nothing is playing in the right ear. So the sound is just going to sound like it's coming from the left. But with the difference that you're introducing in terms of the stereo field, what is happening is that the waveform is altered in different ways, but we still pick up on that those are different, and therefore we just kind of hear the sound very, very wide. If you've ever overdone something like this wider plugin over here, if you've ever set it to maybe like 200% all the way up, then you'll know what kind of feeling I'm talking about, that it just sounds really, really wide when you're listening on headphones in particular. Now, this is where I do have to maybe talk a little bit about the listening environment. This is not something that I have taken into account because I like to take a very analytical approach to music production. I like to use a lot of analyzers and a lot of looking at the waveform, and I also highly encourage that you do so. The reason for this is because most people don't actually have a nice listening environment to begin with, and most people are not like in a studio making music on $10,000 speakers and stuff like that. So they are going to be fooled a little bit by the system that they're working on. Either the frequencies are not represented nicely, but in this case, what is important is that the stereo field isn't represented nicely. With headphones though, there isn't really such a thing as like a normal stereo field because there is no crossover. For an actual stereo field, what you would want is for the left speaker to go to your left ear and to your right ear with a little bit of a delay. It just needs that extra time to kind of move around your head and then go into the right ear. And the same is true for your right speaker. Your right speaker goes into your right ear, and then a little bit later that signal also goes into your left ear, but it has a little bit of delay because it has to travel around that massive head of yours. Headphones are something that is called binaural. And what that essentially means is that the left speaker goes into the left ear and the right speaker goes into the right ear. And what this does in a practical sense is that it gives you a very exaggerated stereo field. Things tend to sound a little bit wider because you don't have that crossover. Now, personally, I think that this makes headphones actually pretty nice to just kind of judge the stereo field of your bass sound, because it's a little bit harder to exaggerate the effect. If you're listening on speakers, it might not be easy to actually hear what is going on with the bassline in terms of its stereo field, whereas on headphones, it should be a little bit more clear. So as I said before, the main requirement that we're looking for is that any processor that we're using collapses nicely into mono. The way that you can test this is actually with Psyscope. Psyscope is showing you a mono signal. So what we would want is, we don't want the stereo fields to actually change the mono signal, right? So let's say that we're using something like this. This is our kick and bass completely mono. If I now turn it on, the waveform shouldn't actually change. We can hear that now stereo field is being generated, but we see that our bassline doesn't actually change. If we look at the left channel, it changes the left channel. If we look at the right channel, it also changes the right channel. What is happening in this case is very interesting in that the change that is made to the left channel is made in an exactly opposite way to the right channel. So, for example, let's zoom into like a little part of our bassline. We again have talked about the fact that audio really comes down to samples. It is really like this list of values that is representing the whole waveform. Say, for example, that we're looking at this sample here, right? If this sample in the left channel is pushed up by a certain amount, in the right channel, it's going to be pushed down by an equal amount. And that means when we're summing it to mono again, we're basically doing the same kind of summing that we're doing here, in that you just take the two waveforms and just sum them together. You're going to get your original waveform back, your original mono waveform. So that's the first requirement. The second requirement is a little bit of safety, in my opinion. What we don't really like is to hear low frequency stereo. Even in the stereo field, I find it's a little bit unpleasant to have the sub bass be completely stereo. So what we can do is we can use a filter to actually filter out the lower frequencies. Personally, I go up to around 250 Hertz, but you can differ that. Obviously, you can go a little bit higher if you want to. You could go a little bit lower, but then you get into the territory where this filter is actually causing you issues in terms of phasing, because it's a filter. It's going to phase shift whatever signal is going to go through it. But right now, as you can see, we are filtering out at 250 Hertz. The waveform isn't really changing, so that means that we can conclude that this is not doing any significant type of phase shift. At least it is not doing any significant type of phase shift in the mono channel. If we actually look into the individual channels, we can see that we have this tiny bit of phase shift right here. But as you can see, I mean, I had to zoom all the way out to actually see that. And in this case, we're heavily clipping the actual waveform that we have. So to be honest, this amount of phase shift, this is going to be okay. Like, this is not going to cause you issues. Now, when it comes to this stereo processing, what I highly recommend is, again, using an analyzer. In this case, we have a stereoscope here. The way that you read this is that this is the left channel, this is the right channel. And what it's going to do is it's just going to take every sample that it has, and it's going to represent it both on the left channel and the right channel. And it's just going to draw a spot where those two kind of intersect. So let's say that for the left channel, the sample plays right here. And for the right channel, I don't know, it plays right here. It's going to take that and it's going to go up to the position of the left channel, and it's going to draw a dot right here. What that means in terms of the graph is that this line here is completely mono. And the wider that you become, the more stereo wave you're going to have. And if you are completely stereo, the line is actually going to be horizontal. As you can hear, the more I turn up the width, or the stereo spread in this case, this has two different parameters. This is the generation, and this is just overall widening of the stereo field. The more I turn it up, the more the graph kind of widens and the more stereo field we get. Now, M stereo spread is actually my go-to. I have been experimenting recently with M stereo generator. This just gives a little bit of a different sound. And one of the things that I recommend is that you have a bunch of different stereonizing methods. Again, obviously you want all of your stereoizing methods to make sure that they are clean, to make sure that you can high pass the lower frequencies. For that reason, if you want to use wider, I highly recommend that you use wider 2. As you can see, this is version 2.0.0. It may be a little bit hard to see, but I cannot actually zoom in here. But this actually has a high pass, which you can just set at whatever frequency that you want. So you're only ever generating stereo field on the higher frequencies, on the frequencies above this high pass. Same is true for here. This is just a high pass that is applied to the stereo field. In this case, that would be the wet signal of whatever process is generating the stereo field here. And as you can hear, we're going to get a different sound out of it, but still a stereoized version. This has a little bit of a noisy texture to it, so I tend to use it a little bit less than the amp stereo spread. But overall, I just recommend that you experiment with that while keeping in mind these few restrictions that you need to have to make sure that it actually works. Now, let's talk a little bit about grooves. There's actually a very easy other groove that you can make, something that we haven't talked about yet. What we have seen is the gallop groove here. This is called the gallop. Another groove that you can use is something like this. This is a little bit of a strange groove in that it doesn't work like this on its own, but it is very common to have this in a longer phrase of a bass. The most common way that you see this is actually if we look at 2 beats, where you would have this note actually play right here. The fun thing about bass grooves is that it's really easy to experiment with. When it really becomes fun is when you include multiple patches. So, for example, what I would do here is I would like to have this bass note just be an 8th note so that it covers this whole entire part here. That means that we're going to just have a little bit more sub bass here and it's going to sound more aggressive, more weighty, and just overall, in my opinion, it's just going to sound better. So let's see how to do that. What I would like to do is just duplicate this and I'm going to separate it like this. Going to make sure that this is an 8th note. Obviously, we have designed this bass to be a 16th note. So all we need to do to actually turn it into an 8th note is to set all of these to 8th note. And we would need to correct for some of the different things that we have. So for example, this would probably need to be here. This will probably need to be here. And now we get an 8th note. And this is a very standard, little bit more progressive kind of groove. Another groove that we're probably all too familiar with is the triplet bassline groove. And what you do in order to get the triplet bassline is you use the triplet grid. I'm going to hit Ctrl-3 in Ableton to get to the triplet grid. And what you want to do is you want to take whatever bass note that you have, and you want to make sure that there's exactly 3 of them with equal length playing in one beat. Then you just remove the first one and you get something like this. Now in this case, because we're using the sub trick here, what is happening is that this sub bass is really turning on halfway through this note here. It's turning on right here. Obviously, we don't really want that is not going to work properly. So in this case, for triplet bass, I almost always recommend going with a setup where the sub bass is contained within the initial patch. And then you use your traditional phase alignments, the traditional way of aligning the bass line to the kick in order to actually make it work with the kick. Another bass groove, which we can really easily look at, is just the offbeat. And in this case, what you'll have is just that second part of the groove that we saw before. We've seen some of these grooves already in the beginning of the video. One that we also saw at the beginning of the video, which is actually also really easy to make, is the swing. In order to do that, we are going to enable this note again. And then I'm going to split this clip up right down the middle. As you can see, we're left with this kind of Frankenstein full triplet note and then this half triplet note thing. And then what we'll do is we'll just duplicate that part over and you get a nice swingy bass line. Obviously, we don't want this. Maybe this is a little bit too much swing for you, but this is kind of the standard swing pattern, I would say. What you can also do is, if you're using a different DAW, use the built-in swing methods. In Ableton, that built-in swing method is used the groove rule, but I have no idea how to use it, and I don't intend on learning that because it just seems very complicated and not really intuitive. So I will just use different methods. One method that I can recommend if you want variable like swing amounts is to use something like Stepic. Stepic is a generator for MIDI. So it's this massive device here, but really what we're going to use it for is just to introduce a little bit of swing into the pattern. We have to set our root key over here, which in this case I believe to be G sharp, yes. So we'll set G sharp 3 to 1, 0. And then I'll just quickly copy this over here. What we want to do in this case is we just want to set this to 4 steps, of course, because our bass pattern is going to be created out of 4 steps. And what we'll do is we'll turn off the first note. We will take the velocity of the second note and turn it down a little bit. And now we can introduce extra swing with this swing parameter here. Now, apart from grooves, the other way to create interest in your kick and bass is to maybe use a different melody. I'm going to move to a little bit of a different space so that I have a lot of room here. You're just going to duplicate over the kick a bunch of times, and we'll use the normal bass pads that we have from the beginning. Of course, we don't want to be in triplets anymore because we are actually going to just be using a normal rolling kick and bass. Let's set it again to G sharp 0, and we'll remove the first note, lower the velocity of this one a bit. And just for the groove's sake, I'm just also going to lower the velocity of this one just a tiny bit. Like I said before, it is sometimes nice to have a little bit of a lower velocity or volume on this note so that this note gets a little bit more presence. So I've laid out 4 bars of this, and what I want to talk about is a few of the things that I've just noticed work. When it comes to music, I like to write in Frisian scale. I write almost all my music in Frisian scale, either Frisian or minor. The only difference between Frisian and minor is where the second note of the scale is. If you want to know the scale, the way that I like to do it is go to A and then just go up all of the wide notes until you're back at A here. As you can see, now we have 1 octave of the scale. As you can see, we're using all of the wide notes. This is a minor scale. You can transpose that to whatever scale that you're working in. And if you want to turn that into a Frisian scale, all you have to do is this. So in my opinion, you can use all of these notes. There are a few that I like that work well. So something like this, for example. I'm just quickly going to turn this off and you'll be able to hear what this sounds like. This is just kind of like a simple little swing upwards. What you can also do is go to number 3 here. So this is 3 notes above the root note. This is a little bit more aggressive. You can go to 5. This is even more aggressive, so that's 5 semitones above the root note. And then you can go to the perfect fifth, which is intuitively 7 semitones above the root note. Now in this case, I've just been moving this 1 note across. What you can obviously also do is maybe something like this. The last thing that you can do, and I don't recommend this if you're at the 7th or the 5th or maybe even the 3rd. I guess the 3rd will be okay, but I mainly see this when you're like either at the root note itself or 1 or maybe like 2 above if you're doing it in minor. And that is using an octave. So you just hold Shift in Ableton and you just go up an octave like this. Or maybe 1 lower. This is an actual octave. Obviously this was an octave plus 1 semitone, which is still in the key that we're actually playing in. But this is going to be like a normal octave. There's actually a funny bass groove / melody idea that I like from Tristan, from his track called Pterodactyl, I think. It sounds something like this, where you just have the octave every time. And I believe this might also be a fairly prominent idea in Goa Psytrance. To be honest, I haven't really listened to a lot of Goa Psytrance. I haven't really explored the genre in any way, shape or form. So to be honest, I don't really know. Let me know if you're a Goa producer, if this is actually common to use in Goa, but I've heard this in Pterodactyl and I've heard it in like maybe 1 or 2 Goa tracks that I've listened to. But overall, those are all of my tips when it comes to like bass melody. As I said before, I know nothing about music theory, so I'm not the best guy to ask about where different notes should go in and what relationship. Also, I haven't in any way, shape or form covered how you would arrange this in terms of like the melody itself, right? We've just looked at where you can place the notes, but I haven't talked about which notes you can kind of erase. To be honest, that is something that you can experiment with. What I have found is that it is a good idea to keep the first note as the root note, because that helps you with phase alignment, in the sense that if you phase align this note properly and you were to move it up, you're going to need a different phase alignment because you're playing the note at a different speed. And in fact, if you like to tune your kick drums exactly to the key in order to phase align, in that case, you're actually not able to go to a different key because they would be out of key, and phase alignment between 2 different keys is kind of impossible. Unless you use the second method of phase alignment that I've shown, where you just remove the sub bass altogether and just deal with the transient. But when it comes to these last 2 notes here, you can really just experiment. What I've found is that just keeping musical phrasing and just keeping the basics of musical phrasing in mind helps, in the sense that you probably want your pattern that you're creating to either be like 2 bars, or maybe you want it to be 4 bars if you want it a bit longer. Maybe you want it to be 1 bar only, or even half a bar or something like that. In that case, it will work. What will probably not work is creating a melody of like 3 beats or something like that. You want to stay within like the bar length that we traditionally use for creating music. And what also tends to work, in my opinion, is if you have either a long segment without any melody and then like an actual melody to kind of counter that, or you just take a few notes here, say something like this, and then something like this, for example. This is just like a little idea. I'll turn it into one clip so that you can see it a bit better. Here we just have like a little final exciting melody for the last bit here. Something like that, in my opinion, tends to work very well. So that's melody out of the way. What I want to focus on now is generating a few different bass ideas in terms of using different synthesis methods. There are a few common extra tricks that you can do, and there's actually a few kind of common layers that people tend to apply to their bass lines as well. This is mainly going to be applicable to people that make like progressive or prog, as I like to call it. Think of artists like Omiki or Blastoise or Jillax, stuff like that. In that case, there's much more liberty in different kind of bass design, as well as layering on top of that bass. I said before that I don't really recommend layering. That's mainly when you're just looking at your rolling kick and bass. When it comes to prog, I do think that it is a little bit more important that you may have like a bit of a stereo layer on top of that or something like that. What I want to start out with though is a bassline type and groove that we haven't really looked at since the intro, and that is going to be the sliding bass. So in order to do a sliding bass, what we need is we don't want that click, right? You'd never hear that kind of click going into it. What we hear is that it kind of slides out of the kick, essentially. So the way that you would do that is you would just kind of create your bass line like this, in the sense that this is going to go to the volume, and maybe we want it to be a little bit more dynamic. And then we can be really creative with what we want for example, our filter slide here. So maybe we want this to like really slide in and then kind of have a little bit of a pluck at this point. So what we'll do is we'll assign this here. We're working in quarter notes, as you can see, because this bass note takes up the whole beat. So as you can see, I was just experimenting with the filter cutoff here, and what we were able to do is just kind of create this shape that really gives us the tonality that we like. What you might say is like, okay, we don't have a click, and we don't really have a transient, and we don't really have any need, therefore, to kind of shift or do the phase shifting in the way that we've been doing before. But I have found that just in general, a phase shifted sound sounds a little bit better. For now, I'm just going to grab this random wavetable to be able to show you that. This is a wavetable, and this is just like a normal saw wave. Obviously, let's assign some volume. The differences are going to be very, very small. Might have also EQ'd this a little bit. I don't know. I wasn't there when he created these bass tables here. But in my opinion, any bassline can really benefit from just overall phase shift. So that's going to be your sliding bassline. The important thing about the sliding bassline is we haven't set the phase up until this point. The way that you would want to set the phase here is you would have to look again at your size scope. It's going to be this crossover point here. Essentially what we're aiming for in this case is we want this sine wave to kind of continue into the bassline. As you can see right now, we have this oscillation here and this just looks a little bit wider. So we just want to tune this so that it actually lines up nicely with the kick. As you can hear, if I open up the filter a little bit more and just give it a little bit more volume around that area, it's also going to be nicer and more kind of together. This is kind of an aesthetic choice. You can also just lower the volume. It will save you a little bit of trouble in that the phase alignment isn't that crucial. If you're going with this very open and very connected style, then obviously it is very, very important. But in this way, it tends to be still nice to have if I were to set this to like an opposite part. This kind of crossover point is just going to sound messy. Therefore, I do recommend tuning this phase as well in a way that it just lines up with the kick. Probably something like that. And again, if you want it a little bit more kind of sustained and together, you get something like this. When it comes to melodies with these kind of bass lines, you hear that often that these bass lines don't stay on the same note, just to keep them a little bit more interesting. What I would recommend is doing something like this. Let's say that we want our melody to be like so. And just for fun, we'll go down here by 2 semitones. Again, I'm staying within the minor key. So I do want to stay in a minor key, but you can obviously also go down instead of just going up. In this case, I'm using a different patch because I am going to need to set a different phase for this. And now you have something that sounds like this. And this is the kind of bass line that you'll often hear on something like a Ghost Rider track or Neelix track. Something that is like progressive, but uses those kind of slower, kind of sliding bass melodies and ideas. Now, another type of bass line that you'll often see in progressive psytrance is the triplet bass line. We already looked at the groove, but now let's look at the sound design for it. To be honest, when it comes to the main patch, all that you really need to do is just make sure that your envelope length or your LFO length in this case is set to 1/8 triplet instead of the standard 16 note. Obviously, so that it matches with the length of the note that you're actually playing. Now, there's a few ways to handle the kick. Personally, what I like is to still use a 1/8 note length kick. As you can see here, we're using the same kick that we were using before. What that usually means for me is that this first note is fairly low in volume so that I can actually mix it in properly. Now, one thing to consider is the way that you're handling the sub and the alignment with the kick. In this case, I would go for some classical phase alignment instead of the trick that I've been showing you where you remove the sub from the first note. In this case, if you do that, you're going to end up with no sub bass here. Or if you decide to like turn it on halfway through or something like that, it's going to cause you issues where this note is just going to change rapidly and the sub is just kind of slowly or suddenly coming in. One of the things to keep in mind is when it comes to sub separation is that you, within the note, don't really want to make a change. So you don't want, for example, a sliding bass line that starts with no sub and then halfway through as the sub coming in. It tends to be the case that then, especially when you're doing processing like saturation and stuff like that, the tonality of the bass sound actually changes because of that. So for that reason, with a triplet note, I recommend the traditional kind of phase alignment where you align the bass to the kick as opposed to the other way around that we saw after that. And then altogether you get something like this. Now, what is very much a part of the progressive style is the kind of strong tonality that the mid-range will have. And you cannot really achieve that the normal way. There's a few things that you can do with like saturation and trying to layer in some distorted versions of the same bass line. But what you'll often see is that the layer is actually used, even though I previously advised against it. It is actually often used to achieve this kind of tonal layer. So let's drop in the serum and see if we can make one. What I want to do is I just want to start off with a little bit more of a complex waveform. I'm just kind of going to choose one at random. I actually like the starting position here quite well. And what I'm going to do then is I'm going to just set up a 1/8 triplet envelope and we'll still use a filter on it. As you can see, what I'm doing with the filter and the envelope in general is I'm keeping it a little bit more open. Obviously, we have to set this to envelope mode here. We'll also create an envelope for the volume, like we've been doing a lot, like this. And then we'll assign velocity here. What I'm actually not doing in this particular case is setting the random to 0 here and setting the phase already. One of the things that you can do is actually use some unison on this. Because this is a layer, we don't actually need like the stability from it. We can use this for a little bit more life, I would say. And you can hear that with a little bit of unison and detuning, you actually get a little bit more life out of it, and each bass note sounds a little bit different. If you don't want that, if you want all of the bass notes to sound the same, you have to turn the random down. But what that also means is because of the way that detuning works and the way that they're all starting from the same position, you're going to have massive phase cancellation because all of these waves are slightly out of tune, and therefore they become more and more out of phase. And you can hear that you get this kind of lasery effect from that. So that might be what you're after, that might not be what you're after, but just keep that in mind because all of the waves are starting from the same position and they're slightly out of tune. They're going to cancel out with each other and you're going to hear these kind of lasery kind of sounds. And this is often associated with something like a comb filter effect, and that is kind of the sound that you hear at this point. So I'm just going to leave the random up, and that means that this phase knob doesn't really do anything because it's going to play from wherever it wants. When it comes to the effects, I do want to highlight one effect that you often might hear on a bassline layer like this, and that's going to be downsampling. You get that nice crispy high end from it that is often associated with that kind of digital distortion. And the way that I like to use it is I do like to turn it down over time. So we just set up an envelope for that, and then we will assign it like this. And then you can tune the tonality of how you want it. I've actually found that I really like the default position of the drive here in Serum. But you can hear that you can place it wherever you want. Another thing that you can do in this case is use a little bit of hyperdimension. What this will do is it will increase the stereo field. This is a way to stereoize it. This is basically going to be the same kind of detune that you'll see in here, but on the process sound. So that's really, really useful. It just creates 4 copies of the sound, detunes them slightly, and then I believe it modulates the amount of detune over time. Again, this is going to have a retrigger function. What this basically is it's going to act like turning down the randomness all the way. So again, you can get these very stable lasery effects, or you can get a little bit more of a free-flowing effect where it's a little bit random and you're going to get a little bit more of a different sound every time. There's also dimension, which just adds some early reflections. So it's going to simulate like it's a little bit in the room, and you can obviously set the size of the room, which determines how late the early reflections play after the original sound. If you set the size all the way down, it's going to play together with the original sound, which is what I would recommend on your bassline. because otherwise it's going to sound like there's actually two bass notes playing slightly after each other. Now this being a layer, let's clean it up a little bit with some EQing. What we can do is we can just turn this up here so that we're not creating any low frequencies. And to be honest, that is probably all that I would do for a simple layer like this. What we could also take a look at, which is often used, but again, I don't recommend using this unless you really have to, is a click layer. What a click layer essentially is a way to enhance the transient. Now, as I said before, there's a lot of problems with phase alignment between all of these different layers and actually making sure that they work well together and mix well together. If you can get the transient that you want from a single patch, then you're going to be better off than layering multiple different patches on top of each other. But for now, let's just quickly have a look at how you would make it if you need it in the future. What you essentially want to do is create a very short clicky sound. And we'll start by assigning velocity because I know that we're going to need it. And then we'll set up our envelope that is going to control the timing of this note here. So because we need a very short, clicky transient thing, what we'll do is let's use a sine wave and let's actually pitch this up and down. Now, the crazy thing is what we could do is we could just high pass this. Then we don't have to actually take care of the volume because when it's pitching down like that, it's going to play the bass frequencies. So we're just removing those bass frequencies. So you're only left with the click really. Again, to turn off any randomness, we will turn down the randomness here so that it always plays in the same way. And then we can start to process it and really make it the way that we want it to be. A little bit of distortion to bring out higher frequencies and a little bit of multiband compression to kind of flatten all of the frequencies. And you can imagine that you can do whatever mixing and processing that you want on this. And you can essentially shape this to whatever tonality that you want to get from it. For the final bassline idea that I want to show in this video, I quickly have to move over to a different project, which is fairly old. I never really finished this one, and I don't really plan on doing so because I kind of lost the creativity for this style of Psytrance. But as you can see from the bassline here, you can see that there's a big group with a lot of different things going on. This is one of the reasons why this project was so hard in order to actually get all of this to work properly together. But the bassline actually sounds like this. The way that this works is that it's your standard kind of gliding bass, and you can see that we just have the modulations here. And then I have this pitch bend in here, which just helps giving it a little bit of extra movement. So just this sliding bass is going to sound like this on its own. We then have some layers for it for some extra metallic feeling. Honestly, I don't remember why each beat needed its own layer. I guess it was the special type of sound design that I was doing by drawing in the own harmonic series that I wanted. I believe each of these is going to be different, as you can see here as well. And that is what creates the unique tone. We then go to the mid-range layers here, and we have 2 of them. Starts with this reverb stab here. And you might say that reverb on the bassline is a little bit dangerous, but in this case, we're not really using it to reverberate the low frequencies. This is just being used to generate some mid-range reverb, as you can see from the EQ here as well. We then have some extra plugs in here, which adds a little bit of extra rhythm still. And finally, I'm layering in this sample here that is coming from an asterisk sample pack that I have. The original bass sample sounded like this. And I've just made that to sound like this. And obviously, as you can imagine, this adds even more rhythm to the bass line. Now, I don't want to sit here and really dissect the sound design. As you can probably tell from this quick walkthrough, I don't really remember what I did here. I do believe that I may have made a video on this bass line or featured it in my last Ultimate Kick and Bass guide. So if I find that, I'll pop up a little card on the screen where you can go to that video if you're interested in learning more. What I mainly want to say though is that this kind of stuff, what I'm doing here, is very, very difficult. Even now going through the project, I can see a couple of things that I would probably change or improve. For example, the fact that I'm not really using one particular patch for the low frequencies. If we look at this patch, you can see that this is also providing a lot of low frequencies here. What I would probably do is choose to have this bass provide all of the low frequencies, all of the sub bass. And then just remove the sub frequencies from this. So something like this would probably be better. And that is going to give you a stronger fundamental because you're not going to have two sub basses potentially clashing with each other, potentially being out of phase with each other. And it should result in a cleaner sub bass overall. Now, I don't want to sit here and discourage you from creating these types of bass lines, but what I would highly recommend is if you're doing this, keep in mind all of the basics that we've been talking about up until this point. Things like separation, phasing, phase alignment, all of that is very, very important to actually make a bass line like this work. And obviously the most important thing that I haven't done here at this point yet is cleaning up this bass line. At some point I would need to go in here and find a good way to resample this to make sure that there's nothing coming through into the kick. Now, one of the benefits of this kind of sliding all complex bass line is that I don't really have to worry about the individual notes because there isn't really individual notes anymore. All of this kind of mushes together into one big mess of a bass line technically. I mean, it's not really a technical term, but I might as well just say it like that. But I would still highly recommend resampling just to have it in a waveform and make sure that it's clean and make sure that the waveform actually looks the way that you want it to. One of the biggest points that I want to hammer on throughout this video is that analyzing what you do with a waveform analysis is a very, very easy way to just see if there's anything crucially wrong with your bassline. Parts of the bassline going into the transient of the kick, parts of the bassline going into the transient of other bass notes. Overall, just having a look at how the bassline reacts to the processing, all of that stuff can be easily checked with a waveform analysis. And one of the big tips that I should give you at this point is if you have a reference track, you have a waveform that you can analyze and compare to. You don't have to just listen to it. You can also look at it. Your eyes also are a tool that you can use to create music. I know a lot of people say you shouldn't rely on analyzers too much because they can trick you. But those are usually the people that work from a very big studio that have big budgets for the best of the best monitoring equipment and stuff like that. And then we don't really get to play with that if you're just a hobbyist producer. Second to that, if you don't know what to listen for, then you cannot hear if you're doing something wrong. So you first need to understand what you actually need to hear. Even up until this day, I cannot really hear the issues that you get from kind of post-stringing into a kick transient, for example. It's really hard to pick that up. Part of that has to do with the fact that it's just really hard to hear in general. Part of that has to do with the fact that I'm, again, not in a perfect monitoring setup. I currently don't even have studio monitors, so I'm just using normal speakers. One of the benefits is that I've been using those speakers for roughly 10 years now, so I know them very, very well. The same is, for example, true for stuff like my headphones, as well as these little things here that I've had for a long while. And all of those different monitoring systems are tools that I use to kind of judge the mix in different contexts. But none of them actually provide enough definition for me to hear something like post-stringing into a transient of a kick. The reason why throughout this video I have been hammering on the cleanliness so much though is because there's one listening environment that does really allow you to hear that kind of thing. And that is going to be a big PA system. Now obviously, as Psytrance producers, we all want our music to be played at the big festivals. That is the end goal for many of us. So having a kick and bass that actually translates well to a big PA system is actually crucial for that. And that is exactly the reason why I've been hammering so much on the cleanliness of the kick and bass, not even in this video, but also when I'm doing, for example, feedback streams, because it would be very much a shame if you take your well-mixed track or the track that you think is well-mixed, go into a club or a festival only to have it sound completely terrible because all of the transients are muffled. So those are just a few of the different bass sound design types and tricks that you can use. They're all going to have their upsides and downsides, and they're all going to have the specific track that you're working on, if it fits the track or not. For example, I wouldn't use any layering if I was working on, for example, a dark side bassline or a high-tech bassline, something like that. I really would preserve that for progressive stuff. Now, obviously, I can sit here for another hour just designing bass patches, but I don't think that that is the most interesting use of my time. I just wanted to show off a few kind of different ways that you can think about just sound designing and just starting off a patch like this. Because everything up until this point has been very, very theoretical in my opinion. So I just wanted to just show off some sound design, which I think is really cool. But I do want to move on to some more theoretical stuff that we have to get through. The next thing that I want to take a look at is a little bit more of a deep dive into kick synthesis. I talked about it fairly quickly and fairly generally, how you would synthesize a kick and what the different components of a kick are. But here you can see a project where I actually spend a lot of time making well-tuned kicks. And I want to show you a little bit of the difference between just doing it in a serum patch like I showed before and actually sitting down and like making a full kick that just works in the track. So this is actually the project behind the kicks from my Psychedelic Drum Pack Volume 1. All of those kicks were made in this project. And in order to BPM tie them, there was a little bit of magic that I was doing technically with the way that I was synthesizing them. What you can see is that we have individual kicks here. Each one of these segments is basically a kick. And then the way that this works is that there's a lot of different racks in here where wherever you set your cursor, you're going to see that it selects a different chain. If you keep in mind this part here, you can see that it selects a different body every time. If I go to the transients, you can see that it selects a different transient every time. And all of that is just one single automation line going up like this, as you can see here. And what this allows me to do is it allows me to chain this to a multi-multi, which essentially allows me to just chain this to a whole bunch of different places where I make sure that every time I select a specific area, only that chain for that specific kick is going to play. Which means in terms that I can just hit record and it will just record out all of the different kicks that you can see here. Because right here in the middle, it is going to switch from one kick patch to the next, from one transient patch to the next, from one head source to the next. I have a processing chain in here, which it's going to switch. I have another processing chain in here, which is going to switch. So you can see that for every different cell here, it automatically selects all of the patches and all of the processing dedicated to one kick drum. Of course, you don't have to do it this way with this massively complex project. I just want to explain the project so that you have an idea of what is actually going on in here. All you really need to know is that we're layering 3 different sources that then go through 2 distinct stages of processing. And in this case, a lot of the complexity is due to the fact that it's all controlled by the project itself. It basically automatically switches for me which kick it's going to play depending on where I am in the playlist. So the way that this was made is I start off with one of the patches. Let's just have a look at one of them. We'll go with the one that is here, because that's the one that actually lines up with this kick drum here. And as you can see, this is very simple stuff. We again have a sine wave, which is being modulated pitch-wise. And then we have another LFO, which is controlling the master tuning. All of this stuff we've seen before. And then we have our final LFO here, which just dials in the volume shape. For a transient, let's look at number 6 here, and what you'll see is that I'm using some of these kick transients here that come standard with Serum. I'm just using a little bit of processing on that in terms of EQing, and in this case I'm switching the polarity. What that means is that we essentially flip the waveform upside down. The reason why I decided to do this probably has to do with the fact that it then lined up better in terms of the layering, in terms of the phase. And in this case, I'm using an LFO tool just to kind of cut out the volume here. I don't really know exactly why this was here. Honestly, it's going so fast that I cannot really see what it's doing. And it has also been quite a long time since I made those samples, so I don't quite remember either. We then have our final source here, which is going to be a hat. In this case, as you can see, I'm loading up a sample, and then we're using these different parameters here. This is going to be the volume envelope to just shape the hat the exact way that we want it. In this case, I decided to go for a very short, very low volume hat. So those 3 sources then go into the processing here, and we'll go to processing 6 here for this example. As you can see, we have 2 EQs here. And what I'm actually doing here is I'm using the phase shift, as I've shown before, of these high pass filters as a positive. We can actually do that even though in the patch here, what we have is we have this very strict volume envelope. I'm not really keeping to this volume envelope later on in the chain, and I'll actually show you why in a little bit. But this first line of processing is really meant to process it in terms of taste. I'm not really thinking about exactly how it's going to work in the track and exactly how it's going to be aligned and stuff like that. The bigger thing of these EQs here are just to make sure that I get the tonality of the kick the way that I want it to sound. What I then do is I record to this track. This is just going to record from the sources directly. Actually, the recording is done right here, and then I just drag it down one channel. The reason why I do that is because I have the processing on here. This is going to be the processing that actually makes it work in the track, or which makes sure that the kick works from a purely technical standpoint. What you'll see here is that I'm doing a little bit more EQ, and then what I'm doing specifically is again using a high pass filter to make sure that in terms of the phase, it is going to line up with the BPM here. What that means in this case is that I want it to zero cross from upwards to downwards. That was the convention that I set for myself. Now, not all kicks sounded great doing that, but most of the kicks, when it's just going down, as you can see, it is very, very close to the zero crossing. And as I said before, this actually helps us mixing in the transient of the bass line. I then have my final recording where I can just check to see if the kick does exactly what I want it to. As you could have seen from the processing, we also have this LFO tool here, which is just making sure that no stuff is actually happening in the part where the bass is supposed to play. And all of the samples, the kick just stops shy before the halfway point of the beat. So you can see that real kick synthesis is really like a step-by-step process where you just create the kick, you create all of the sources that you want. Maybe you want to do a little bit of layering, like I said, with the transient layering or the head layering that I'm doing in this project. Then you use some EQing or some other type of processing to get the tonality right, to get it to sound the way that you want it to sound. And then you just go in and check again for all of the cleanliness factors. You check if you have it aligned properly and all of that stuff. And obviously doing that part last will make sure that whenever you save this as an actual sample, which is what I would recommend, that everything is in order and it's just a kick that you can just drag into your project and work with. The reason that I say I recommend saving samples is because I recommend making a project like this as opposed to making your kick every time you start a new project. Because to me personally, kick synthesis as well as bass synthesis, to be honest, it's not really creative work. It is just something that has to happen in order for you to start actually being creative. And personally, I don't think that it's very, very enjoyable spending 2 hours at the beginning of your new session working on the kick and bass. So I much rather spend a little bit of time, and this actually took quite a lot of time to actually get this right, working out all of the different kicks and working them out for all of the different BPMs in order that you can just drag and drop them in whatever project that you want. And it will just always sound good and be properly aligned. Now, one of the things that I quickly want to tackle is kick tuning. There's a few ideas on kick tuning, especially when you're looking at traditional phase alignment, in the sense that you want to have your kick in tune with your bass, so that you can actually align the sine wave of the kick together with the sine wave of the sub bass. In my case, because I use a different way of phase alignment where I just completely remove the sub, what I'm doing is I'm really tuning the kick on feeling. And what I like in terms of feeling is, if we look at the bass line here, which is in G sharp, I'll usually design my kicks to be 1 or 2 semitones below that. So you can see that this kick actually goes down to F sharp. The effect that this gives you in terms of what the sub bass is doing is that for the kick, the sub bass is going down over time. And then when the bass notes start to play, the offbeat bass notes start to play, and they start to provide the sub bass, you get this little dip up, and then you have the sub bass of the bass line. And this overall is just a very nice groovy effect that I really, really like. Now, the opinions are going to differ on that, and it's going to depend on the technique of phase alignment that you're using. I've seen people that tune their kick very precisely to the same note as their bass line. I've seen people that tune their kick above the bass line, and I've seen people do it like me, where they tune the kick slightly below their bass line. Now, throughout this whole video, I've been hammering on the cleanliness of the kick and bass, and I've specifically said that you shouldn't just add a high-pass filter to your kick and bass. But how then do you do transitions? Also, how do I make sure that things like kick fills and effects are actually clean? Let's have a look at this project here. This is a production project that I've shown off many, many times on this channel. It's probably the most discussed project that I have. And there's a lot of interesting new ideas that I'm using here. But when it comes to the kick and bass, I've essentially been doing it this way throughout the whole time that I've been producing Psytrance. Now, a little bit of background for me. I haven't been producing Psytrance my whole production career. I would say even now, main majority of my production career, I've actually been making other music. And in all of the other genres of music that I've been creating, there was a distinct distinction between all of your drums, including the kick, and then the bass lines that you would have. So for example, for a long while I made dubstep, and in that genre the kick and the bass are very distinct. So what you'll see is that the kick and the bass are actually placed in different groups in the organization of the project. And I've also implemented that workflow myself into Psytrance. So going into this production, what you'll see is that we have a kick group over here. I'm sorry that nothing is named here, but you can see we have a bunch of different kicks. We have extra kicks for the kick fill here. And then this is going to be my main bassline group, which contains my main rolling bass, as well as my progressive offbeat bass here for the second drop. Now there's two different types of filtering that I like to do on my kick and bass, and that is static filters turning on and off, as well as moving filters going up for transitions. So for example, we have this high pass here, which you can see is slowly moving up. Now, as I said, we don't really want this high pass to change the phase of the kick or to change the phase of the bass. We don't want to mess up that phase alignment that we have crafted. So in this case, I am using linear phase. This is going to introduce a little bit of pre-ringing. Actually, in this project, as you can see, I'm using 2 linear phase EQs. This is just doing some general EQing, as you can see. Actually, some quite significant EQing being done on this kick. But the main EQ that I want to focus on is going to be this linear phase EQ here, which is just set up to do the filtering, either from the high pass as well as the low pass. And then I've just assigned those to macros which have a set range, so that I can easily dial in a macro, dial in an amount, and this will just create the transition that I want. And as you can see, I'm using that all the time to either go upwards or to transition downwards in some cases. And what you'll find is that you can pretty much see the same thing happening to the bassline. There are a little bit of differences between that, which is really nice. The fact that I have differences between the kick and the bass allows me to be a little bit more creative and not have the kick and the bass follow the exact same filtering for all the time. I know most Psytrance producers do indeed use a kick and bass group and do their filtering on that. This would be one of the 2 reasons why I would recommend against that. The other reason we'll discuss in a little bit. But essentially, this allows me to have a lot of creativity of exactly what I want my filters to do. Something that also tends to be on both my kick and my bass group is a little bit of a volume here. As you can see, we are just changing down the volume right down here. And the same is going to be true for the kick. Now again, this allows me to set different volumes for the kick and the bass. And you can see that I'm using that here, where the kick is going down in volume in this part, whereas for the bass that is actually not happening. Now in this case, the reason why I'm doing that is because this part is part of a build-up. And as you can hear, we go into this very dark, very low frequency part of the kicks actually. And the kicks are also speeding up. So I don't want that to be overwhelming. And that's why we are just turning down the volume and then bringing it up a little bit back again so that it actually amplifies a little bit more and you get a build-up feeling. Overall in the track, that's going to sound something like this. Now those are the transition effects. What you can also already hear are some of the fill effects. In this case, what we have here is a reverse kick. And all that a reverse kick really is just a part of the kick reversed into the kick that you have here. What I personally like to do is I like to chop off the beginning of my reverse kick. As you can see, this is just part of the lower frequencies of the waveform. That way, what you don't have is that you don't double up on this impact essentially. And you just have this kind of sweep going into the transient here. So what that means is that this transient still has a little bit of punch. If you were to take this, and you can see how much I'm chopping off of the kick to actually achieve this. If you were to take this and you were to place it right here, for example, it would sound a little bit more lasery. And what happens there is that this transient really loses its definition. So purely for that reason, what I like to do is I like to do my reverse kicks with just the low end of the kick. It still gives that reverse kick kind of vibe in that the bass kind of comes in and it prepares you for the next section, which is essentially the goal of a fill. But you're leaving out a lot of space for the transient, in this case in the frequency spectrum. And that means that when this kick actually plays, when this high end actually plays, there's nothing playing before it and you get a little bit of an extra impact feeling. Now there's other things that you can do as well. As you can see, when it comes to build-ups with the kicks, what I like to do is have them on a separate track. That way it's just a little bit more organized and I can quickly set volumes if I need to. Then I have my main kick fills. Those are going to have an individual track as well. As you can see here, I'm actually using the volume. And what you'll find is that when it comes to my kick fills, I like to do them in audio. And the main reason for that really has to do with the fact that you get to see the waveform and you get to just see if everything is clean. Just like with your standard kick and bass, it is actually fairly important that all of these kick fills are very, very clean, especially when you're doing very fast rolls. I see a lot of people doing their kick fills in MIDI, and there is some benefits to that in the fact that you can assign like arpeggios to it and do unsynced kind of kick fills really easily. but there is a little bit of an issue in there in that the samples can actually overlap if you're not setting up the sampler correctly. Now, I'm not going to discuss the various rhythms used here and the various different ideas used here. What I do want to show you is this little thing here where one of the things that we're doing is we have these really fast reverse kicks coming out of the main kicks. And what essentially happens with these kick fills is that I tend to follow rhythms of other things. So for example, here we have this scratchy sound here. And what I wanted to do is I want to give that a little bit more punch with the kick fill. So together with the kick fill, you get something like this. And then what we also have is some other drums in here and some other stuff. So if we listen to the whole fill, the whole kick fill, all of it together, you're going to get something like this. And there's just a lot of experimentation going on in one, finding the right rhythm and also finding the right volume for all of these kicks. As you can see, I am messing with the volume of the individual samples. You can see that down here, this is at 0. There's going to be many that are actually at 0, but these are at -2, for example. This one is at -5. And this is again for my reverse kicks, and this is for my normal kicks in my kick fills. So you can see there's a lot of organization, which just easily allows me to check the waveform, see if everything is clean. And that way I won't get any problems with messed up transients or anything like that. Now currently in this project, I'm not really using any other type of transition method. There are a few other ones that you can do. For example, you could add a lot of stereo when you're transitioning. So for example, in this breakdown, I've temporarily removed the volume, but you can see I'm filtering very heavily. And because this is a breakdown, we don't really care about like the exact stereo field of it. This kick and bass is going to be playing in the background in this part actually. But you could, for example, make this kick and bass very wide with some stereo generation, or you can apply something like a redux, which is a very common technique. Personally, I like erosion a little bit more. I just think it's a little bit cleaner, but it's essentially the same effect. You set it to sine mode, you give it an amount, and then we'll just automate this up and down. Let's copy this to the bassline as well. And you can see that you get that same high frequency ringing type of idea that we saw when we looked at the sound design for the layer. In this case, it is just moving around in the frequency spectrum, and that's really why I like erosion. It tends to be a little bit cleaner when you're moving it around. Now again, this is something that you can obviously experiment with. You can apply whatever effect that you want or what you feel like it, phasers, flanges, whatever you want. When it comes to breakdowns, I think you can really go loose and do whatever you want, especially if you're turning back the kick and bass in volume like I'm doing here. Obviously, for the example, I've turned that off, but you understand what I mean. But when it comes to transitions in the drop itself, I would limit myself in the way that I'm using transition effects. Again, you're going to have the discussion about stuff like cleanliness, and something like a phaser or a flanger is definitely going to mess with the phase. I mean, it's even implied in the name phaser. Now, there is a little bit of a hack to that. What you can do, because we only really care about the lowest frequencies, if you're already in like a high pass section of the transition that you're doing and you're not going down again, you can then start to include something like a phaser or any other effect that would normally kind of destroy your low end, but because the low end is already removed, it's not going to matter anymore. The last thing that I want to show is this little trick here. As you can see, I have a small section here where I'm turning up this EQ. And the way that I'm doing it, if you zoom into it, as you can see, it is turning on and off when the kick is not playing. So as you can see here where the waveform lines up, the kick isn't playing here and the kick isn't playing here. And if you go down to the bass, it's going to be the same thing. This is actually a sidechained sliding bass line, so the bass won't be playing here and it won't be playing here. Right in these areas where it's turning on and off again. Now this is actually fairly important because you cannot just turn on an EQ. What will actually happen when you turn on or off an EQ like that is that the filters will suddenly start to appear and to play. And there's something called a initial zero condition which needs to be met, which essentially for our purposes means that there's going to be clicks and pops when you're turning on and off a filter like that. That is, unless the signal going through the filter is actually silent. In that case, you're not going to have this issue because the filter is not actually like being triggered by any sound coming into it. But this is a really cool trick because it allows you to just filter out the kick and bass for a little bit. In this case, I'm using it for a fill, so you get something like this. Now, in my opinion, this method of turning off and on an EQ is a little bit cleaner than just automating these up and down again. For one, these filters are not going to affect any other part of the kick and bass, and even the effects that they're going to have on this kick and bass in terms of the frequency shift is in this case in such a high frequency area that like we're not introducing any part of post-stringing that might go in here or that might up changing the balance in any significant way. Also, we're removing so much frequency content that any shift in phase is probably not going to make the sum of the two louder than it was before. So it's not going to cause any like clipping issues when we're going into mastering. So overall, I would say this is a little bit of a cleaner way than doing it. The only thing that I would say here is that I would like to have these filters static. When I'm doing this trick, I never really move these filters. As you can see from here, these filters aren't actually being automated. If I click through these, same is true here. None of these two are automated. And what you'll also find is that I've volume compensated here, minus 7 dB, and probably the same on the bassline. There it is. Another thing that you could do in this case, and that sometimes really works, is taking something like this, putting it in a rack, and then turning on and off the rack. That way, what you could, for example, do is add a little bit of extra distortion after it, so that you get a nice gritty kind of bass sound here. Obviously, you don't want the distortion to be on all the time, so having it in the rack and then turning it off together with the filter that actually makes sure that you're filtering out all of the low frequencies and sometimes also the high frequencies is actually fairly important. Another way that you can do this, which I haven't done in this project, but which I often do, is by just recording a little part of your kick and bass and then applying that onto a different track, cutting that out of your original kick and bass so that you have it on a separate audio track, and there you can just distort it however I want. I usually put that in the effects because this is something that I like to keep in the background in a fill or something like that. And therefore I consider that part of the kick and bass more of an effect sound than actually part of the kick and bass. Now, as I said, my kick and bass aren't actually together in a group. I don't do any processing on my kick and bass together. The first reason is that you cannot really do any normal kind of filtering on your kick and bass without messing up the kick and bass phase relationship. If you have your kick and bass phase aligned and you put them together in a group and then you apply some kind of filtering or a multiband processor, they're going to go out of phase again. You're going to mess that up. And this is true both for the phase alignment as well as the overall cleanliness of the kick and bass. The other reason for that is, as I said, I don't consider them part of the same element. At the very beginning, I talked about what the function of each of the kick as well as the bass are. And the conclusion was there that the kick is the main thing that we dance to, and then the bass line is really there to fill up the rhythm and to fill up the lower frequencies. So fundamentally, to me, they aren't part of the same element. They don't have the same goal. They aren't supposed to be like this one element combined. And this kind of mindset is also what allows me to do creative filtering differently on, for example, the bass line as opposed to the kick, which we saw before in this project. So those are my two reasons for not using a kick and bass group. And what you'll see later on when I talk about mixing is that that continues for the whole production essentially of the track. Even in the mixing stage, I never combine them into one group and process them together. The final gluing that I achieve on my kick and bass really 100% comes from the fact that I am treating them all like separate elements, and then I do that kind of gluing in the mastering. So I have a master glue compressor which is taking care of the gluing that you want to have between the kick and the bass. It is also just including every other element in it because obviously this is in the master chain, but the gluing is obviously also applied to the kick and bass, and it does then slightly like unify the kick and the bass together like you would want from your kick and bass. But before that, I never have a point where I actually combine the two together and process them together. The final thing that I want to take a look at today is my mixing setup. The reason why I include my mixing setup is because I actually mix in a different project, and therefore I think it is important that we have a look at what I'm doing in the mixing project as well, to just make sure that my kick and bass stays clean and nothing gets in the way of the balance between the kick and bass that they have so carefully crafted in the production. So here I have a mixing project. As you can see, this is a Reaper, and let's just go in here. This is going to be our kick channel. You can see we have a main kick, and then we have some alternative kick channels here as well. There's also a head layer, which for now we're not really going to worry about because this is mainly high end. I think a big theme that you'll see throughout this video is that a lot of your problems are going to be the low end. This does not mean that I just want to discard the high end. There's a lot of different things that also are happening in the high end in terms of mixing and stuff like that. But these more include stuff like the drums and stuff like that. Whereas with kick and bass mixing, you're mainly going to be focused on the low end. Obviously, the whole frequency spectrum is important, but the main time and effort that you're going to spend is going to be arranging the low end and the lower mid range of the kick and bass. So this is the kick and bass for this track here. And you can see here, just to show you how I'm keeping it clean, I decided to EQ this kick a little bit, including in the lower frequencies. And then immediately after that, I decided to have an LFO on here to just make sure that the kick really returns to 0. Now, as I said before, I'm a fan of analyzers, and as you can see, I'm using a couple of different analyzers in here as well. The two main ones that really pertain to the kick and bass are obviously Psyscope, which we have been using throughout the whole video already. And then the second one is going to be M-Analyzer. I have this nice and big. And what I'm doing here is I usually compare this either to a reference track or a reference kick and bass that I know that works. This just overall gives me the tonality of just the kick and bass. So I can see that in terms of the spectrum, it really works the way that I want it to work. And obviously, if that is not the case, I go into an EQ and I make the changes that you can see here. Same is true for the bassline. In this case, what I decided to do for the bassline is that there was a little bit more work that needed to be done in terms of its saturation, in terms of its overall richness, in terms of the frequency. So you'll see, I actually use multiple saturators here. I have an LFO tool here, again, to clean it up. I have another saturator here. This is followed by a different LFO tool, which is just doing a little bit of dynamics processing. This waveform doesn't really say much, but you can see what it's really meant for is almost acting like a compressor on the transient, like it gets triggered by the transient, and then with a long attack, it starts kind of like compressing the waveform a little bit. This is a really cool trick actually that makes use of the fact that the bass line here is a recurring 16 note. Every time that it plays, the waveform is essentially going to be the same because I've designed it that way. And therefore we can use this LFO tool to essentially shape it dynamically. It is then summed together with the stereo layer that sometimes plays. This is going to be the stereo layer that you hear here. This is kind of, again, your kind of mid-range frequency stereo layer. So this is going to be nice and wide, nice and spread out. In this case, in the production, I already removed the low frequencies, but I also decided to remove a lot of the high frequencies so that the stereo layer doesn't clash too much with the transient of the bassline. And then after we have the stereo layer in the production, I actually decided not yet to do the stereo processing. So here we have a little bit of stereo spread to induce a little bit of extra stereo wave into it as well. This is obviously the stereo layer, so that's going to be nice and wide. But if we listen to the main bass line, you can actually see that it's quite wide for bass line actually. But I do really like the sound of it and the way that it works. This is just a little bit of extra noise coming from one of the saturators, and that shows up quite nicely on the graph here. That's actually fairly interesting. We then have our equalizer for our final tone, and this being an equalizer which is affecting not so much the lowest frequencies, but even like the lower mid-range. I just wanted to use another LFO tool to make sure that it's cleaned up when the kick plays, and this is also doing a little bit of volume balancing between the first note and the last two notes. And finally, we're introducing an overall volume increase to do a little bit of gain staging before we go into the actual fader. Now, volume-wise, what is important to know for my mixing is that all of the tracks that I have, if I go into item properties, you'll see our gain stage to be -8 dB. And this is actually their peak level. This is just kind of like the convention that I like to work with mixing, and it is nice to have a standard convention. This is true for all of the different tracks that you'll see throughout this project. But it is important with the kick and bass because the volume difference between the kick and bass is actually fairly important. I personally like to have 1 to 3 dB of difference between the kick and bass. And that means that the kick is going to be 1 to 3 dB louder than the bass line. Now, there's many different ways of measuring loudness. Often it has to do with also the dynamics of it, as well as the overall frequency spectrum if you're talking about something like gloves. When I'm talking about loudness in this case, what I really mean is just the peak level. That is the convention that I go by. And the reason for that is in terms of the dynamicness of both the kick and the bass, they're basically equal in the sense that they're both not really dynamic elements. If you look at, for example, the sub of a kick, they're fairly flat. And there is a little bit of difference in here in that there is a little bit of a lower volume in here. This bass line is lacking a little bit in the dynamics because it's a wavetable bass line. We talked about that before, how they have the issue with lacking a little bit of dynamics. But honestly, measuring this stuff in peak level for me is fine, especially when we're just talking about the volume difference. A lot of this volume difference is actually going to be negated once you go into mastering because they're both going to be kind of squashed by the final master limiter. What is more important to me though is that there's this idea that the kick is the priority. The kick is supposed to be the most important element of the track, and in fact it is also often the loudest part of my track. Sometimes if I have some particular vocals that really need to stand out in, for example, a breakdown, they will be louder, but 99% of the time the kick will be the loudest element. Now when it comes to mixing, probably the most important tip that I can give you is when you look at something like a kick and bass. Let's scroll through this project. We have the kick and the bass. There's other, in this case, over 100 more tracks in this project. In fact, if I close this group here and I close this group here, you literally cannot see the kick and bass, but you can see all of these other tracks coexisting with the kick and bass. And that's really important when you keep the kick and bass in mind. One of the issues with starting your project with the kick and bass is that you can be hyper-focused on details that you won't even hear when the actual track is finished. So for example, listen to how the kick and bass are being masked here by the rest of the elements of the track. Notice that in the mid-range there's a lot of synths, and in the high-end there's a lot of drums and stuff like that. So to be honest, in most cases a lot of the details, a lot of the very, very small things that we like to spend hours on tweaking aren't really going to matter in the context of the whole track. What is much more important is that the overall picture is correct and that the overall cleanliness is correct, because those are things that really affect your low end, and in the low end your kick and bass are going to be on its own. This is actually your reminder that when you're mixing and creating your other elements, you do want to make space in the low end for all of the kick and bass to actually occupy, because you want your kick and bass to have the maximum range of power that it can have in the lower frequencies. Now I can show you a bunch more projects if I wanted to with different kick and basses and a lot of other stuff that is interesting, but I don't really think that I need to, because I just can explain through the hand of the project that we just saw the basic principle behind it, and then from there you can just apply it to your kick and bass however you want. The main idea that you'll see when it comes to mixing is that you're just fixing things. You're no longer kind of designing the track. The track is already there. You just have to make sure that everything works in the space that it's given. So for example, that stereo layer that we saw, it needed to be a little bit more stereo so that the main bassline can cut through the mono space a little bit more. We saw some saturation. I wanted to bring out some extra frequencies from that bassline so that it stood out more from the other elements in the track. We saw a bit of EQ and some more stereo processing. That is again to put it in the space where it sounds the way that it's supposed to sound. And then the final important thing, which you constantly saw of all of the LFO tools in this project, is once I do something that can potentially damage the kick or the bass in a different way, I immediately think about, as the next step, okay, how can I fix that? How can I clean that up again? And that is the way that I want to work in this mixing stage, because I don't really want to sit here, throw on 20 different plugins and do all of these fancy things and then discover that one of those plugins is causing an issue. And then all of the other plugins are amplifying or changing that issue in a way. And then by the end of the chain, I have to look through the whole chain to identify what the issue really is, what is going on here. I'm constantly trying to be aware of the fact that I cannot really mess up the cleanliness of the kick and bass at this point, that I should keep that intact. And as you can see from the different types of processing that I'm doing, and the ways that I'm using, in this case, as I said, LFO tool, is that I'm constantly cleaning up after myself to make sure that the sound just doesn't get messy and it only really plays when I want it to. So for example, the kick only plays in the first half, the bassline doesn't overlay with the kick transient. All of that stuff is really, really important for a clean kick and bass, and overall, in my opinion, a well-produced track. Now, the final thing that I want to talk about is more like the long-term plan of learning all of this stuff. I've been producing music for a decade now, and I've been making Psytrance for about 4 years, I would say. And to be honest, what I've found is that the more I look at making kick and bass and the way that you can make it better or easier or maybe do it differently, the more that I found that the really important part is focusing on your overall storytelling. Even though this video is like 3 hours long at this point, I don't want you to actually spend like 3-4 hours on your kick and bass every time, because that's not really creative work. What you should probably aim for when you're producing your Psytrance track is to quickly get the kick and bass down, lay down the rest of the track, lay down the rest of the context that you can then use to really check what your kick and bass is supposed to sound like. Then you can do all of the stuff that you want to do in terms of processing and stuff like that. And obviously, at the end of it, you have to make sure that you spend a little bit of time actually cleaning up what you have done, whether that involves resampling, whether that involves turning it into a wavetable and remaking the patch like that. Obviously, there's going to be the part of phase alignment. That's also very, very important. And then later on, when you go into the mixing stage, it is very important that you keep those things intact. But once you've done that, once that's sorted, there's really no way to kind of mess it up in a way. Then when it comes to long term, as long as you follow these ideas of producing clean, well-produced, well-polished kick and basses with all of the methods that I've shown today, what you'll find is that every time your kick and bass is just going to basically improve naturally. There's not really a lot of thinking that you have to do to keep on making better kicks and better bass sounds. Because just by doing it, that is what you learn, because you're just subconsciously kind of printing in your brain the idea of what a good kick and bass is supposed to sound like. Now, obviously, this can be sped up by listening to a lot of reference tracks in your listening space. Something that I always recommend and that I do almost religiously is listen to roughly half an hour of professional music, professionally mixed and produced music before I actually start my own sessions, either production or mixing. And that just really helps tuning my ears for the type of sound that I'm after. To be honest, what I think the biggest mistake is that a lot of people are making is that they don't really do that. And what they'll end up doing is they'll spend like 2-3 hours working on their kick and bass at the beginning of a project without any context, without any referencing, and they'll just fall in this loophole where the kick and bass is not quite sounding what they want, and it's not quite the way that they want it to be, and they just add on plugin after plugin trying to fix all of the issues that they hear without realizing that they could fix all of it by just stepping back a little bit, listening to some reference material, getting your ears in check, getting your ears in tone again, and then just focusing on this approach where instead of worrying about the kick and bass at the start of the project, you worry more about it towards the end of the project. As you've seen from the stage where I talked about mixing, I don't really do a lot of the EQing and the tonality and all of that stuff towards the beginning of my bassline creation. I haven't talked about EQ throughout any part of the initial session that we did in Ableton. And the reason for that is I don't know what the track is going to sound like yet. I don't know what the bassline is going to need in terms of EQ. I don't know what the highest frequency of my kick is going to be in terms of EQing, where I'm going to put its low pass filter to make room for example, the drums. If I don't have the drums yet, I'm not really sure how I'm going to make space for the drums yet. Now that's going to be everything that I want to say on kick and bass in this video. There's probably more that I can say on it. There's probably a few more examples that I can give. There's probably a few more techniques that I can look into and research a little bit. But to be honest, this video has been 2 months in the making and I'm getting a little bit tired of it. I'm happy that I've gotten to the process where I can actually film it and all of that stuff. Usually the preparation is the most annoying part, because it's just figuring out how to condense a very, very big topic and say as many things as possible in the shortest amount of time. And as you can see from the video length, that's not something that I'm really good at. Also, if I spend another few hours talking, the video is just going to be way too long for anybody to enjoy. Even now, I think that making this video, it's just going to be too long for anybody to fully watch. If you did fully watch it though, in order to have a discussion, let's make it so that if you get to this point in the video and you've seen all of it, include the word yellow in your comments. That way I can kind of filter out who has seen the whole video from all the way through, as opposed to people that comment 5 minutes in. So with that being said, this is going to be the end of the video. Let me know if you enjoyed this one by leaving a like. It will obviously really help with this video. If you're new here and you enjoy this kind of content, make sure to subscribe. And if you want to support me financially, you can do so by checking out my products on Gumroad, as well as my Patreon page. But that's going to be it. I hope you enjoyed and I hope to see you in the next one. Hopefully that next video will be a little bit shorter. Bye bye.